There is another universe, a lot like ours. Entrances to it are scattered throughout the world, in places where most psychological energy gathers. Schools, hospitals, those kind of places. During any leap year, on February 28th, this is the period of abnormal astral activity which opens the doors. At exactly midnight, the minute between the 28th and the 29th. If you're lucky, or unlucky enough, to be by one of these doors, it will open and beckon you. In this other universe, things are mostly the same, except all love and all hate relationships are reversed. Your worst enemy is your lover. Your best friend is out to kill you. Those kinds of things. It's a nice head trip. A good escape from this reality. Have fun. But remember, if you enter, you are stuck there until next leap year. There is a moment each leap year, at exactly 3 minutes past 3 on the morning of February 29th. If you possess the courage, await that moment in a darkened room with no one present. At that moment, the darkness will deepen. If you were to hold your hand directly in front of your face, you would not see a thing. But you must not do so. No, for that would be to waste the moment. Instead, you must reach out into that impenetrable darkness, and it will reach out to you. An unseen hand will grasp yours. You must not flinch away, nor tighten your grasp. To do so will only slough away more of the decrepit flesh that covers it, and anger its unseen owner. Remain perfectly still as the withered fingers move over your palm, tracing unknown patterns. Do not move an inch as it crawls slowly up your arm, and most of all, do not even breathe as it caresses your face, touching what cannot be seen. Should you remain still through this, the hand will be withdrawn and a voice will speak, so close you can feel its breath on your face and smell the scent of decay it carries. It will ask you for one simple piece of information: your name. Answer truthfully. Answer truthfully, and the presence will retreat, leaving only a whisper in the air as the darkness lifts. It is done. From that day on, untold good fortune will be yours, and mysterious power. You will lack nothing, and have everything. But in a year, perhaps 2, you will feel your skin begin to decay, and smell the sweet smell of death upon your breath.
This is not a story I wanted to tell. I'm the sole survivor of a social experiment known as the Soul Paradox. I've been in hiding, and though it pains me to say it given the circumstances, soul searching. I've been presumed dead for some time. It's better that way. When I signed on for the experiment in 2006, I didn't have much to live for. Participants were offered food, water, and shelter for the duration of the experiment. There was supposed to be cash at the end, though it wasn't much. Participation meant cutting off ties with my friends and family. I had none to start with, which might be why I didn't see the requirement for the red flag it was. I had recently dropped out of college. My parents disowned me, angry to be on the hook for student loans while I amounted to nothing. None of that matters now. As I tell my story, I realize there's not much I can tell you about the experiment itself. This is partly because I was misled about the true nature of the study. Even at the time, I didn't know it was happening. I'd go in for regular tests that lasted hours at a time, but I'd come out with a hole in my memory. It's not that I forgot exactly, because I never lost my sense of time. When I try to remember, there's a black space. A long stretch of blackness with nothing except time. I remember the time with great significance. When the black stretch of time ended, I'd find myself signing a clipboard just outside a door marked "Testing in Progress." I was always tired after. Aside from the tests, I felt like I was living on the set to some Big Brother-type reality show. I remember that much. I lived on location with other participants. We were given roles and had to go to counseling sessions once or twice a week. The participants were extremely diverse, not just race, but also religion. It was impossible not to notice the emphasis on religion. A few people even tried converting me. It didn't work, though I was always receptive to the discussion. As an agnostic teetering on atheism, I was interested in everyone's beliefs. Though I wasn't sure what I believed, we didn't have much else to talk about anyway. No one remembered what happened during the tests. We were forbidden from discussing them with one another. Not that it mattered. All anyone could say was, "I don't remember, and I'm tired after." Another popular topic of discussion was dreams. If I remember correctly, a Buddhist woman named Shinhwa was the first to have recurring dreams. At least, she was the first to talk openly about them. She'd tell us of a dream where she was reborn as a tiger. At the time, I found it fascinating, though I had a feeling she was leaving something out. Soon after this, there was an incident where she attacked herself and others. I wasn't in the rec room at the time, but I heard she carved stripes into her skin with a knife she smuggled from the kitchen. She attacked 3 people. I never saw her after the incident. My counselor said she'd been removed from the experiment. By then, I had the sense to be afraid. I feared I'd made a terrible mistake and had suspicions that the doctors were lying to me. They made it sound like Shinhwa and the others were sent to a hospital for their health and safety, but I was convinced they were dead. I wasn't wrong. Though the doctors made me feel crazy and explained my fears away as paranoia resulting from sleep deprivation. I wasn't lacking in sleep, but with the testing I never felt rested. The testing started to freak me out, more and more. I'm not even sure how I was forced to do it. I only know the black space with a sense of time and the exhaustion that followed. Exhaustion and fear. The other participants were afraid too. We all started to have dreams where Shinhwa would attack us with wild eyes, bleeding stripes, and inhuman strength in her small hands. I vividly remember my flesh between her teeth and the strange agony of my belly being split open and eaten. The last thing I remember of these recurring deaths was the wet sound of her chewing. After we died in our dreams, we wouldn't wake up right away. We'd be sent to our respective afterlives for judgment. The other participants always described being sent to hell or some equivalent. That's where my experience diverged. Having no religion, it was different for me. No less terrible, but different. I wouldn't go anywhere. What happened to me can't be explained with words or feelings or pictures or anything, because it's not something you can experience with your senses or your mind, except that I did in those dreams. The closest I can come to explaining is by comparing it to the black space with a sense of time, except there was no black space. There was nothing. Nothing is nothing. Not even black. But there was time. I was aware of every passing second in the nothing until I woke up. Nothing but nothing and time and an eternal hum I somehow understood to be like cosmic electricity or a generator. This would last hours until I woke up, and I'd feel every maddening second of it. I started to get angry. I'm angry now because I know I'm not coming across right. There's no way to explain what I experienced, which is frustrating. But it wasn't just that. My anger only grew over time. I became jealous of the other participants. They each had religious revelations. I didn't. Even when those revelations had led them to end their lives or the lives of others, the certainty and substance that came with their religion was more than I had. At least they had something. I stopped caring about my suspicions. I stopped caring about the doctors, the experiments, the participants, or the tests. I only cared about religion, hoping I might avoid the fate my agnosticism afforded me. I didn't believe in anything, but I also didn't not believe in anything, which I'm sure is what brought me to that horrific trap in nothing time. Of course, with the chaos and death around me, I was in no position to try on other religions. It wouldn't have mattered if I could. With what I'd experienced, I couldn't put my heart and mind into truly believing anything. As much as I didn't want it to be true, I'd already found my truth. By this time, the participants were dying in droves. I didn't die, but I was mistaken for dead. One morning, I woke up and couldn't move at all. I couldn't even open my eyes. I distinctly remember the sound of the nurse as she came in and said, "We have another one." She spoke with casual indifference, or maybe resignation. I was one of many deaths discovered that morning. I know this because I found myself tossed on top of a pile of bodies. With my eyes closed, I couldn't see them, but I still felt them. Clammy, wet bodies that stank of feces and blood. No one checked to make sure I was actually dead. I was dumped with the bodies somewhere in Macau State Forest, where I stayed for days in that state of paralysis. The bodies rotted around me, but I could only lay there as the flies bred, fed, and multiplied on and around me. The incessant buzzing, blindness, and paralysis reminded me of nothing time. It was better, though, because even if my eyes were closed, I knew things were there. It was better than nothing. I could still think, smell, feel, and listen. I wasn't dead, but given where I was, yet another body in a mass grave. I didn't expect to live long. That should have been the end of me. In a way, it seemed a merciful way to go. I was being eased into nothing time with my experience in the woods. Then one day, the paralysis. I can't say I didn't feel the pull of death. I still feel the urge sometimes, like a reflex to jump in front of oncoming traffic. It was an itch I didn't scratch, perhaps because I had no God to tell me I should. I left the bodies in the forest, alive but in a strange state of decay. Couldn't go public like that, for all intents and purposes. I was dead. I made a home in rural Alaska where no one asked questions. The people who lived there were also trying to disappear. Unfortunately, the wounds from the soul paradox aren't the kind that can be healed with time. In the time since, I've tried and failed to find religion. It's too late for that. I've known since I first experienced nothing time, but I still had to try. I have concluded that the only thing life has in common with death, at least for me, is time. Time is the same whether you're dead or alive, and now I spend my time keeping track. My tongue ticks out the seconds, flicks at the roof of my mouth. With the constant clicks, I know I'm still alive. Fearing death like I do, I won't end myself. Yet I know I need to prepare myself for nothing time. The hum of the eternal generator. I spend days buried under a loose mound of dirt or snow, with my eyes closed. It reminds me of my time in the forest.
Being a military camp guard, as part of a small detachment, I was frequently assigned to do night patrols around the camp perimeter. For one of the patrols, I was walking along with a partner, wanting to complete the round before I turned in for the night. Walking around the building, we suddenly heard footsteps coming out from the building. We paused and checked our watches. It was 2 a.m. in the morning. We decided to walk around the building, checking every exit. It was a secured building that stored millions of dollars worth of equipment. Each exit was armed with an intrusion detection lock. Each lock was armed. We heard more footsteps and decided to radio back to the guardhouse. "Is there any night ops going on?" "No, everybody in the camp has checked out." The guardhouse holds the keys of the important key presses. When these keys are all turned in, no one except for the essential staff, like camp guards and other personnel on duty, are in the camp. There's footsteps in Building X. All locks are red and armed. Advice? Continue with your patrol. We'll check in with duty orderly. The DOS checked the building soon after, and there wasn't anyone around. My first job as a software engineer was working at Adam Osborne and Associates at the marina. It was 1977, and I was developing simple example programs to run on the earliest microcomputers. I had a lab area with the Radio Shack TRS-80 and an Apple II, a North Star computer, and a few others. We had a small number of employees, maybe 12. One night I was working late, 2 a.m. I was the only staff person in the office. All of a sudden there was a horrendous crash and a thud, and I heard people running in the front door. I went to hide in our little stock room behind some boxes. Some young thieves had appropriated a concrete utility cover from the sidewalk out front and chucked it through the window pane of our front door. Then they just turned the handle and they were in. Piece of cake. They grabbed 3 IBM typewriters and ran right back out. The whole episode only took 30 seconds, and they roared off in their cars. I never saw the getaway car. I dialed 911 while listening to my heart pounding and waited for the cops to arrive, and that was pretty exciting. Then came the scary part, calling Adam Osborne at home at 3 a.m. and telling him what happened. Forever after, years later, anytime I ran into Adam at a trade show or a show place, he would greet me warmly and remind me of the episode. I was in the middle of a job where I had been contracted to build a new control system for a calendar mill the rolled rubber into sheets. I had installed new control panels, and during setup, the system did not work as expected. So I was under a lot of pressure to find the problems and correct them. I had been poring over the schematics, looking for design errors, when I found a possible problem. This was late on a Saturday night, and I wanted to check the panel to see what could be causing the problem. When I got to the factory, it was closed. Normally, it stays open 24 hours, but this was a holiday weekend, and they had closed the entire plant. I had a security card that opened the doors 24/7, so I just went in through the back door and used the headlight to make my way through the panel that I had installed. I took off the back panel and sat on the floor. As I was busy tracing the wiring, a light was shined in my eyes and someone yelled, "Freeze!" I look up to see two cops pointing their guns at me, and they were shaking with fear. It was not the cops with the guns that frightened me. It was a raw fear that I saw in the cops' faces that had me scared. They had responded to a silent alarm that I did not know existed, and they had entered the same door that I had left open into the dark, scary factory floor. They had seen my headlight bobbing around behind the strange panel and taken me as a robber or an industrial spy. We all laughed after I straightened it up with them. I actually knew one of the cops. They both said that they were scared shitless of having to creep up on me in the dark, seeing my light flashing around. I often work at night, so as to not to get in the way of production. In another incident, I was working at an unfamiliar city at night in an industrial area. It was cold, with 6 inches of snow on the ground. All the equipment in the building was shut down, except for the industrial furnace that had a noisy blower running on a timer. The timer ran down, and the furnace stopped, leaving it dead silent, except for the footsteps I could hear someone walking across the roof. At first I thought I was hearing things, but they started up again, and I followed them from below. I went to the back door, made sure it was locked, and peered out the doors towards my car 50 meters away in the parking lot. It was then I noticed footsteps in the snow going around my car and right to the door where I was at. Just then I hear rattling and the shadow of someone coming from the fire ladder. I hide from the window behind a metal grinder and saw 3 hooded men drop from the fire ladder and go back towards my car. They peered into the doors, so here I was in a strange city with 3 men trying to break into my car and the building I was in. I finally found a phone in the office and called 911. It took forever for the cops to get there, over 30 minutes. It turned out that there were 3 kids in a gang who had set up their hideout on the roof of the building that was normally empty at night. They had hidden stash of stolen goods on the roof, no big deal, but hearing footsteps on the roof of an empty building in the dark of night really got to me. As a youngster, I was working in a food store. The shop was open 24/7, so naturally, sometimes I had to take the night shift. To be honest, I preferred working at night because there aren't as many customers and I didn't have to overwork. Plus, the money was slightly better. Usually, I was working with the same guy from the team, and this was a rule. Our boss didn't want to leave the shop with just one person. The area wasn't dangerous. There was mostly single-family houses and schools, and it was in a safer area. One day I came in to work the night shift. I was waiting for my friend to join me when the phone rang. It was Tom, my workmate. He said his car had broken down in the middle of nowhere, and he couldn't leave it there. I didn't want to stay in the shop alone, but I understood that Tom couldn't just leave his car too. I would usually call Julia, another workmate, but I knew it was her birthday and she was throwing a party and I didn't want to ruin her night. I called my boss and I told him I would manage on my own, and he agreed on that. The night was quiet and calm. The shop was visited by parents who forgot to buy milk for their children, young men who wanted some beer, and teenagers who wanted to buy popcorn before they started to watch a horror film. After 11, it fell silent, so I opened a book and started reading. I was entirely wrapped by the crime story I was reading when I lifted my head and saw a man standing at the street, staring at the shop. Usually I wouldn't pay it no mind, but this case was unusual. The man was wearing a white suit, a hat, and had crutches, as he didn't have a right leg. I felt awkward. He was just staring at the shop and looking at me. After some minutes I was scared and regretted that I hadn't ruined Julia's night and asked her to come and join me. After some time the guy left, but I still felt nervous. I was alone in the shop and didn't want to call anybody and wake them up. I decided that reading a book will be an excellent way to start thinking about something else. I open the next page and the telephone rings. I pick it up and said, "Hello, how can I help you?" Nobody replied. I heard the sound of breathing. I asked again who was calling, but after some seconds, the person hung the phone up. This was the moment I was terrified. I was sure it was the guy in the white suit. I had plenty of strange thoughts in my head, including the one that I was a protagonist of a horror movie and was gonna die in some minutes. I knew I couldn't stay in the shop alone anymore. I called my father and immediately asked him to come pick me up. I also sent my boss a message that I had to close the shop because I felt sick. My father came in around 15 minutes, as he was also scared after hearing my story. For me, it was the longest 15 minutes of my life. I locked up the shop and was fighting the irrational thoughts in my head. After my dad came, I felt relief, but I also didn't imagine going back to work at night again. The next day I wanted to hand in my notice. I knew the shop was 24/7 and all the workers took different shifts, so I didn't want to ask for any special treatment. I went to the shop and started to explain everything to my boss, telling him that I'm leaving, when he interrupted me. He said to me that he was talking with some man 2 hours ago, the man with one leg. I think my heart stopped beating for a minute after that. My boss continued to say that the man came to the shop to say sorry for staring at the shop and calling at night. The guy assumed that he must have scared me by calling. The man also said that he had been many years abroad and came to the town after 50 years that night. He was looking at the shop because he was living there when he was a kid. As we understood, it was a normal house back then. His family had to leave the country because of political persecution. The man called the shop because he found the number in the yellow pages and wanted to ask how long the shop existed. Plus, he didn't even know I saw him. When he was calling, he didn't say anything that moment because it was very emotional for him. He started crying, and of course, he didn't want to talk in such condition. All in all, he wanted to know what happened to the house during those years. I was bewildered hearing the story and didn't know if I wanted to leave my job anymore or not. Happily, my boss told me the shop can only be open at night if there are 2 workers, otherwise it would have to be closed. In the end, I stayed at the shop for some time and promised myself not to work at night alone anymore. I haven't met the guy in the suit. He probably left town, but I hope he's okay after that. This is the scariest thing that ever happened to me while I was night shift security at a data center. I was just an 18-year-old kid, and my job was to sit in the office all night, alone. This was in the early days of the internet. There was no Facebook or YouTube to kill time. Usually, I took the time to study or practice a guitar, but sometimes I needed a break from that. I decided to photocopy my face, which led to my butt and other parts. I'm the only one in the building, so it's super easy. But then, the paper got jammed after having copied my parts. There was about 1 hour before the early people would start coming in the office. I had no idea how to open this very expensive copier, and there was no manual anywhere. I was pulling the parts off, trying to remember where they came from so I could put it back. No smartphones to just snap a picture and know how to put everything together. I had pulled off and replaced many parts that gave me no access to the jammed paper. There was only 30 minutes before the first people started coming in, and what if someone decided to come in early that day? Long story short, I managed to figure out how to remove the offending jammed copy with literally only 3 minutes before someone came in to the office. This isn't a scary story, but it scared the crap out of me. For a while, I worked the front desk at a retirement home. My shift was from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., basically the black of night. The retirement home was nice, 3 stories, and the people lived on their own apartments and had maids to clean up after them. There was a restaurant inside that served the residents meals. Everything was nice and new. There was even an atrium in the middle of the building that had plants, water features, and a big jacuzzi. My job was to be at the front desk in case anyone needed help. Part of my job was also to walk the floors at night, just in case one of the oldsters needed anything, and to make sure the outside doors were all shut. It took me about 20 minutes to walk each floor. I had to walk the circuit at least 3 times on each floor, but it was up to me when to do the intervals. After I finished the circuit, I would go back down to the first floor where I could watch TV or read until it was time to make another round. I didn't particularly like being the only person awake in that building in the wee hours. I would have to go into the back of the building and check some of the doors, and that made me feel uncomfortable. One night, I was sitting on the couch in the first floor lobby, and I thought I saw one of the residents walking across the atrium like he was drunk. Sometimes residents would bring liquor into the atrium, which was okay as long as it wasn't in a glass bottle. I didn't have a good vantage point of the atrium, with all the dense foliage and my angle from where I was sitting. I got up and entered the atrium from the south door. I looked around just in case someone needed help, but I was the only person in there. I went back to the first floor lobby couch and started watching TV again. I couldn't concentrate on it though. I kept thinking of the atrium. Something about it was bothering me. I decided just to make one more circuit of the building. I got in the elevator and went to the top floor and started my walk. All quiet. I then used the back stairs to get down to the second floor. Also quiet. Except for one of the residents running their TV very loudly. But no one had a complaint, so there was no need to knock on the door. I was almost back into the elevator when I looked over the side of the atrium. I saw someone in yellow swim trunks. I wasn't alarmed. I figured one of the residents was taking a late dip in the jacuzzi. Supposedly the jacuzzi wasn't to be ran after midnight, but hey, they were adults, so I wasn't going to give them a hard case about it. It was getting near 4 a.m. and I could barely keep my eyes open. I turned on the TV and sat down at the desk to do some paperwork, anything to keep me from nodding off. While I was sitting there, I saw someone walk across the atrium from the south side to the north side, just like before. Okay, now I'm getting a little pissed. Sometimes the residents have a little fun with the staff. Also, some of these old birds and cats were getting it on at their age, and there had been some crazy things happening, especially when they brought out the booze. At some point, after 4 a.m., I fell asleep at the desk. I was startled awake a few minutes later when I heard some commotion in the atrium. I jerked awake just in time to see one of the residents run across the atrium to the other side. I only saw him for a second, but he had on the yellow swim trunks. I couldn't see where he went, but I could see that the north side door was propped up with one of the rocks that decorated the atrium. Propping the door open like this was certainly odd. Okay, fun games, people, I thought. Playtime is over. I got up and went to the south side atrium door. The door was stuck. I yanked on it, but it didn't budge. So I had to scurry all the way to the other side of the atrium to enter through the prop door on the north side. As I stepped into the atrium, I could hear that the jacuzzi was on the highest setting, and it was absolutely roaring. There was about a dozen beer cans on the cool decks. I marched over the fake bridge that spanned fake rocks over the river that was on the middle of the atrium. There was someone in the jacuzzi alright, but he was face down in the water. I jumped in and grabbed his arm to turn him over and start CPR, but it was already too late. He was non-responsive. I yelled for help, but the residents couldn't hear me. Most of them were hard of hearing. I tried to haul him up the jacuzzi steps, but couldn't move him much since he was twice my weight. I ran to the lobby phone. He had jammed the south side door open with some more big rocks, so I had to run fast to get to the lobby so I could call 911. The EMT showed up quickly, but my resident had set up his suicide very well. After the autopsy, the resident starter told us that he had 5 times the amount of alcohol of those 12 beer cans in his blood. I was pissed off that he played cat and mouse with me all night and left me to clean up the mess. And on the other hand, I felt guilty that I wasn't able to intrude on what he was up to. I blamed myself a lot for a long time. Also, if you've never been with a corpse alone in the dead of night, I can attest that it is increasingly horrific. I spent time working at a mental health unit for a private care home. There are always loads of stories of eerie things going on, and I never believed them. There are a couple of times I was freaked out though. Part of the job was to patrol the corridors, checking that the residents were asleep and in their beds. An important bit of info, which is relevant, is that the unit that I worked on was classed as a challenging behavior unit, basically violent or aggressive residents. The unit had been built for 40 residents, but because of the nature of the clients, the most they ever had was about 14. This meant that the place was mainly empty. One night I was doing a check on my own at about 3 a.m. I had pretty much finished my rounds and was about to head back to the lounge to continue watching TV in an attempt to keep myself awake. As I was heading back, I heard a bump noise and some muttering down one of the corridors. Thinking it was a resident, I walked towards the noise. It seemed to be coming from room 40, which hadn't had a resident in it for years. I was on my own. All the other staff were in the lounge. I didn't recognize the voice, and as I got to the room, I heard a loud bang. I opened the door and went in. It was a pitch black empty room, perfectly tidy with no one else in there. I freaked out and checked every room on the way back again. Chatting with the staff a few weeks later, they asked if anything eerie had happened to me yet. Playing it down, I said no, but it turns out room 40 was supposedly haunted after a member of the staff was fatally wounded there by a resident. I never told anyone at work about the incident, but it freaked me out. On a side note, not quite night shift, but eerie nonetheless. I was called into an emergency day shift. A resident was dying, and they needed extra staff to cover the floor while staff tended to the resident in his last moments. There was a call system in the building, like a hospital, which links to the pagers that the staff have to respond to. Each room has one, and the pagers allow you to see who's calling and if it's an emergency. Anyway, the resident passed away, and it was quietly told to the staff while they sorted the funeral details with the family. I was sitting in a lounge when the pager system went off for his room. Thinking the staff needed help or supplies, I went into the room. I popped my head around the door to be told that they didn't page anyone. I checked my pager, and it was his room that was calling. I reset the system and left. This happened 3 more times after that, each time within minutes of my leaving. Eventually, on the last time, I went to take the batteries out of the call system. A few minutes later, his room went off again. I still had the batteries in my pockets. We were all freaked out a little by this, so I went back one more time. The nurse that was dealing with the resident was shocked to hear what was happening. Even when I showed her the pager, saying it was a room calling, she paused and turned to the deceased. She knelt down next to him and said, in the most soothing voice ever, "It's okay, Bob. You can rest now. We'll be here for you if you need us." The alarm never went off again while he was there. We put the batteries back in after he left and the system was fine. Never had a fault again, or never went off unexpectedly again. Many years ago, I was a technical writer for a state office. My office was half of what had been an interrogation room for the Attorney General at one time. Since then, millions had been spent in renovations for the building, which had been built in the 1880s. It may have looked shiny and new, but it had some old residents left from before the renovations. I was working late and was sitting at my desk, which was U-shaped, with the center being the only open area for my office. A coworker came in, and the two of us were sitting there, at each end of the U, making revisions on a document together. Suddenly I felt like someone was in the office with us, but there wasn't anyone. The door was to our backs, but it felt like someone was on the other end of the U curved part, where my computer was. No one could have gotten there without walking through us. As we look at the spot where it seemed like someone was standing, the cord to my desk phone lifted, and it looked like someone had dropped it off the edge of my desk. I look at my coworker and she looked at me, and then we looked back at the phone cord. It was swinging back and forth, then suddenly it stopped in the dead center, as if someone put their hands out and held it there. It totally stopped swinging. She said, "Did you see that?" and ran out of the office. I left, took a walk, and went back to work a little bit later. What else was I gonna do? About a week later, I was at work late again. This time, I'm sitting at the bottom of the U, at my computer. Off to my left, I had a stack of papers, maybe 10 or 12 pages, and my glasses were laying on top of them. There was nothing near them, no air conditioning vents, and they were out of my reach. However, as I was typing, out of the corner of my eye, I saw some movement. I turned my head just in time to see the pile of papers, with my glasses on top of them, slide about 6 inches down my desk. Other things had happened over the years, but these were the two that stood out most in my mind. This was a long time ago. Let's see, about 37 years ago, as of 2016. I worked at a full-service gas station just off the highway around the South Manchester, Connecticut, USA area, just off Highway 84, going towards Hartford. Usually it was pretty quiet at night, but one time we got robbed. The robbers pulled up to the gas pumps in a car. They asked for money in the drawer. One guy had a gun, and the other guy had the gas pump. Somehow, they ended up spraying me with gasoline, and they were flicking a big lighter. They got the money and drove off. I called the police, who in turn called an ambulance. Then I called my parents. Somehow my parents beat the ambulance to the hospital, where I had a saline flush to get the gasoline out of my eyes and nostrils. This was one of many interesting nights I had as a teenager working at gas stations, but the risk of being burned by a madman with a lighter while doused in gasoline certainly takes a cake.
My mother and father were killed in an awful car accident when I was 6 years old. Since then, I have been raised by my aunt and uncle in Texas along with my older cousins. It took a while for me to adjust to this new familiar arrangement, but in time, I came to accept my aunt as a loving mom and my uncle as a trusting, sensible father figure. But the person I was closest with was my cousin, Lacey. But we were much more like brother and sister. Living in Texas, we often went hunting and fishing. My uncle taught us both to be expert marksmen when it came to hog hunting, which comes in handy in the southern United States, where these wild pigs are considered a pest due to their effect on the ecosystem. By the time I was 13, I had become a terrific shooter,
My uncle sometimes joked that I would become a police sniper, but over time, my cousin and I both developed an interest in computers. This was in the late 90s and early 2000s when the internet was a much newer phenomenon, and the idea of an information superhighway was very fascinating to both of us. Lucy is 2 years older than me and thus graduated sooner. She was accepted into the University of Texas with a scholarship in computer sciences. As for me, my initial enthusiasm for computers has waned into casual interest, and I chose instead to focus more on sports journalism. In the summer of 2006, I had finished my sophomore year of college at USC, and Lacey had been spending the past 2 years working for a technical firm in Houston. It was my summer break, and I hadn't seen her in a while, so I flew into town to visit her for a few days. After spending a few hours catching up with each other, she brought up a subject that has since come to haunt me, something she referred to as the dark web. One of her coworkers had bragged about spending time there, claiming to have purchased drugs from there on numerous occasions, and also watching some hardcore videos that cannot be found anywhere on the regular internet. Lacey learned that this part of the web could only be accessed if you were a really good hacker. This predated Tor software by several years. Apparently, hacking had become a hobby of hers and she was interested in checking it out. I figured, what the hell, right? What could possibly be so bad about this dark web? Well, plenty, as it would turn out. As we went browsing through this part of the internet, we both lost count of how many videos they were showing animal torture. Hitmen for hire were advertising their services, as were drug dealers. Some videos seemed to be live streams of genuine torture, which caused us both to cringe. Despite all of this, Lacey still seemed to have a strange fascination with this place, while I had begun to lose interest. Eventually, she came across a link to a place called TJ's Horror Shop. It sounded corny as hell, but Lacey clicked on it anyways. She was greeted by a message informing that a show was going to be taking place that night, but that it was members only. The page had the option of allowing her to register, which she did. Southern Nerd 04 was the username she chose, if I recall correctly, and she was apparently accepted. She seemed somewhat excited, but I wasn't too keen on the idea of her being associated online with that type of people who hide themselves on the dark web. After her registration was accepted, we were shown a digital clock, gradually counting down to beginning of the livestream. It seemed to have taken an eternity, but the clock eventually hit 0 and the screen lit up. We saw a masked man dressed up in leather and wearing skull gloves. He was twiddling his fingers like Mr. Burns, and he spoke in a deep, distorted voice.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to TJ's Horror Shop. For all the newcomers, it is my pleasure to welcome you into my house of horrors.
It seemed like a silly little show, but given everyone else we had seen in the dark web so far, I wasn't convinced that something truly sinister was out of the question.
Tonight's first victim.
2 other men, also wearing masks and dressed in leather, dragged another person into view like he was some sort of hostage. He had a bag covering his head.
Andrew Fleming of Charlotte, North Carolina, 43 years old, divorced, father of a son and daughter. He has been selected as the first victim of tonight's bloodbath.
I began to feel sick to my stomach, and I noticed Lacey was beginning to look uncomfortable as well.
For those of you who are new, my viewers are the ones who get to pick how our victims die. Your username is selected at random. After your name is chosen, a box will appear giving you several choices. The option you select is the method in which this poor bastard will die.
One of TJ's henchmen ripped the bag off the hostage. The man was sobbing in terror, and he was pathetically begging for his life. I sincerely hoped this was all just an act, but I was becoming less certain of that by the second.
And now, let the selection process begin.
On the left side of the screen, all the usernames of those watching began to briefly flash up at random. Apparently, some sort of algorithm was using some kind of lottery system to pick who would determine this man's fate. Eventually, it settled on the username Who Gives a Crap 771.
Who Gives a Crap 771, one of our favorite guests.
TJ shouted in glee.
Now, you must choose how Mr. Fleming will meet his demise.
a box appeared that showed the following choices: A. Strangulation, B. Mutilation by chainsaw, or C. Repeated gunshots. The user settled with C. Very well then, let the carnage begin. One of the masked henchmen appeared from off-screen, armed with a sawed-off shotgun. He aimed the gun at the man's genitalia and fired. Lacey and I both gasped in horror, while Mr. Fleming howled in extreme agony. The henchman lifted the man up and shot him in both kneecaps, causing him to drop back onto the floor and continue begging for mercy. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The henchman took out a 9mm pistol and emptied the entire clip into his back. I couldn't bear to watch anymore. I looked away and lost my lunch. I heard one more gunshot, and the man's screaming stopped. I guess that was the fatal blow.
What a delightfully gruesome display. Now, on to our next contestant.
The henchman dragged another person into view, also with a bag over their head. The bag was removed to reveal a blonde female not much older than me.
Melissa Cartwell of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 23 years old and single. You are our next victim. Now, let's see who gets to decide your fate.
As before, the slot on the left of the screen began flashing names at random, and much to our horror, it settled on the username Lacey had chosen. Tears began to well up in Lacey's eyes. "Lacey, shut this damn thing off," I said to her.
Southern Nerd 04, a newcomer. We are pleased to welcome you into our gruesome family. Now, you must choose how Miss Cartwell dies.
Again, a small box appeared, but with several different options: flaying, electrocution, or incineration. Lacey only sat there, frozen in horror. "Lacey, get off this page now," I said in an increased panic. Several minutes passed. TJ had grown impatient.
Well, Southern Nerd, we are waiting.
Lacey began to frantically press buttons, hoping it would somehow allow her to exit this awful place.
If you don't choose within the next 20 seconds, you will be on our next show,
TJ said menacingly. For a moment, Lacey appeared to be considering one of the three murder options, but before she could choose, I ripped the power cord out of its outlet and shut the damn computer off. Lacey broke down, sobbing, and I rushed over to comfort my cousin. "You don't think they'll find me, do you?" she said fearfully. "I don't know." I stayed with Lucy a few more days before returning to the apartment where I was staying in Los Angeles. I wanted classes to resume so I could get on my degree in sports journalism, but it was the middle of July. The whole situation with those wackos on the dark web appeared to have blown over, or so I thought. I opened up my laptop as soon as I returned home, and I was greeted with a horrifying sight. My generic desktop background had been replaced with an image of a masked man, the same type of mask I saw TJ and his henchmen in that terrible livestream. Suddenly, a video box appeared and a video message began playing.
Hello there, Jason. It's me, TJ.
Shivers went down my spine at the mention of my name. Where the hell did he get it from? And how the hell did he manage to hack into my laptop?
I believe we have a hostage here that might be of interest to you.
The camera angle changed to show. No, it can't be. Lacey! She was bound and gagged and sobbing in the corner of the room where TJ was filming. There were cuts and bruises on her face.
Remember when I told your cousin here that she would be a part of our next show? I'm a man of my word, Jason. She had a choice to make and she refused to answer the call. Now she will pay the ultimate price.
He bent down and pet her hair in a very creepy manner, causing her to cringe.
Or will she?
I sat there, motionless, waiting for what he would say next.
I've decided to make things a little more interesting for our next show. Your cousin will have a chance to survive, if, and only if, you eliminate this man. A photograph of a middle-aged man appeared on my screen. Raymond Marshall, 53 years old, of Los Angeles, California. No particular reason why I chose this random person, except for the fact that he happens to live near you. You now have a simple choice. You will murder one person to potentially save another.
Another box appeared on my screen showing the options of yes and no. I sat there in dead silence trying to process everything. Should I become a murderer to save my cousin? I sat there staring at the box, asking if I would accept taking on the task of killing this man whom I've never even met.
20 seconds, Jason. Tick, tock. Tick, tock.
I heard TJ taunting. Not much time to consider things. A very awful predicament to be in. TJ began audibly counting down.
10, 9, 8, 7.
At 7, I finally clicked on yes and regretted it almost instantly.
So, you've agreed to play along. Very well then. I will give you until Friday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, which is when our next show will be. Be warned, one of my henchmen is currently in Los Angeles and he's watching your every move. You know, just in case you try to chicken out. Oh, and we're also monitoring your communications, so don't even think about calling the police. Don't even think about attempting to warn your target either.
I knew right then and there I was trapped. I was going to be a murderer or not, and all for the chance of saving Lacey.
If you haven't eliminated your target by then, my henchman will eliminate you. There is no backing out of this. Shouldn't be a problem. Your cousin tells me you're an excellent shooter.
Until Friday at 6 p.m. Well, at least he gave me time to mentally prepare. That's a little over 2 days from now. Late at night, I was tossing and turning. I couldn't sleep. My consciousness was deeply troubled. I was wishing I could die, but that would be viewed as chickening out and surely get Lacey killed. I decided I wasn't going to wait until Friday. I wanted to get it over with now. I got dressed and walked out of the apartment parking garage. I opened up the toolbox in the bed of my pickup truck and stared at the assault rifle I had used on many occasions for hog hunting when I was growing up in Texas. I had brought it with me to California when I drove out here to attend college, but I hadn't had the time to go hunting since moving out here. I pulled it out from the toolbox and tossed it into the back seat of the cab. "Put this on," I heard a voice say. Startled, I turned around and saw a tall man in a hooded sweatshirt wearing a mask. "Let me guess, you're the psychopath's puppet," I said sarcastically. "Put this on," he repeated in a more aggressive tone. He was holding a headset in his outstretched hand. I took it from him. "This headset has a small camera implanted inside. It will provide a visual confirmation that you have carried out your task. Any attempt to tamper with it, and I will kill you." They really had their bases covered. "Such a lovely crowd you hang out with," I said to him as I climbed into my truck. I saw him turn around and walk away. I couldn't see him or his vehicle anywhere in sight. With that, I started the ignition and began driving to the address that TJ had provided me for this person. All the while, I saw a dark SUV with tinted windows tailing me the whole way. I tried to make out a license plate number, but the dim light made it very difficult. I eventually arrived on the street where my intended target lived. His house was directly across from the street from a park. I decided it would be easier to hide from my target if I parked my vehicle over there. I saw the SUV that had been tailing me make a sharp U-turn and park itself on the other side of the street. They weren't kidding that he was watching my every move. I rolled down my window slightly, just far enough for the muzzle to be sticking out. Just then, I heard my iPhone buzzing and felt it vibrate in my pocket. I had it shut off, but it just suddenly reactivated itself without my prompting. I took the phone out of my pocket and realized what was up. TJ and his cronies were hacking into it. I was greeted by the familiar image of a masked man dressed in leather.
Welcome back again, loyal subscribers. As usual, we have quite a show for you in store. But before we get to the main event...
He went off screen for a few moments and then dragged a woman in front of the camera, hands tied and mouth covered in duct tape. It was Lacey.
Will a man become a murderer for even the smallest chance of saving his cousin? To find out, let's go live to Los Angeles.
On my phone, the image of TJ was replaced with the live camera feed from the headset his henchman had given me. I knew this was my cue to look at the target's house across the street. I noticed the henchman got out of his parked SUV and walked up the man's driveway. Apparently, this man was a night owl. The lights in his house were all on, and I swore I could hear his TV blaring. Maybe he lived alone. The masked man rang the doorbell and stepped off to the side of the house to hide. A man arrived at the door. It was him, my target. I heard him shout, "Hello, who's there?" I took a step outside. That was it, my moment of truth. I gathered every ounce of strength and fortitude I could muster and pulled the trigger. A direct hit right between the eyes. Raymond Marshall was dead before he hit the ground. The henchman emerged from the side of the house and walked up to the corpse to visually verify that he was dead. After he had done so, he looked in my direction and gave me some kind of hand gesture, presumably a signal of verification.
Well, there you have it. Our friend did indeed have it in him to carry out this murder, and since I'm in a generous mood, I will not kill his cousin.
I hear TJ shouting over my phone. The henchman got back into his SUV and drove off into the night. I watched as he drove away. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that relief was short-lived. TJ backed away from the camera, and another one of his henchmen appeared on the screen, armed with a shotgun. After a slight hesitation, he shot Lucy dead. I was in utter shock and disbelief. I had done exactly what the psychopath had asked me to do, and Lacey was still murdered. I had just done something I found to be morally unconscionable, in the hopes she would be spared, and as it turned out, it was all for nothing. I spent the next 2 days sobbing in despair. My cousin, whom I had loved more like an older sister, was gone forever. I found out that my aunt and uncle had filed a missing persons report. They had tried to contact her several days ago, but couldn't get a hold of her. I feigned ignorance about what had happened because I just couldn't bring myself to tell them. I sat alone in my room back at my apartment, pondering what to do next. Those men had to be punished. But one doesn't maintain a murder show on the dark web without being masterful at covering their tracks. But even the most careful criminals slip up eventually. Then, I remembered something. The headset I had worn that night, the one with the camera installed. Could it possibly still have footage on it? Perhaps not, but I decided it was worth a shot. I didn't really have any other options, but I remembered the basic hacking tricks Lacey had taught me. I put the headset next to my laptop and went to work. It was a pain in the neck, but I was finally able to hack into the headset's camera. I expected to see nothing but a blank screen, but much to my surprise, I discovered a memory file in the camera. I clicked the file, and yes, footage from the murder. They had slipped up and forgotten to delete the memory. But that was only the starting point. I needed something else to go on. The henchman had kept his mask on the whole time, making it damn near impossible to identify him. The video reached the point where the henchman drove off and I noticed something. There was a short moment where the vehicle passed under a bright street lamp before disappearing into the darkness. I saw a license plate, but the image was a little blurry. I hacked in a little more to see if I could clear up the resolution. It worked, and I got a clear look. It was a Nevada license plate. Yes, I was one step closer. Now to type that license plate number into the database. The vehicle was registered to a man named Zachary Parker in Reno, Nevada, about a 7-hour drive from Los Angeles. I was also able to acquire his address, and I knew I was now on the trail of my cousin's killers. You're going down, TJ. I'll make sure of that, even if it kills me. I packed some food, some rope, and duct tape, as well as a handgun and a hunting knife that I had also brought with me when I drove out to California 2 years ago. I ended up purchasing a taser gun and pepper spray, just in case. Also, I brought a tape recorder just in case I might need it. I told my roommates that I was taking a short trip and would be back in a few days, but truthfully, I had no idea if I would be coming back at all. These were some bad characters that I was dealing with. I departed Los Angeles at approximately 1 p.m., but extreme traffic issues added another hour to my trip. I arrived in Reno at around 10 o'clock at night. It took me a while to find the address because I wasn't exactly familiar with the area, but eventually, I arrived on a quiet street in a nice-looking neighborhood. It was a medium-sized single-story house, similar in appearance to the one I had grown up in Texas. And there it was, in the driveway, the black Toyota 4Runner with the same license plate number. I stepped out of my truck and began to creep up to the house, hoping nobody on the street would notice me. Suddenly, the garage door began to open. I ducked to the side of the house to keep myself out of sight. I saw a man step out from the garage entrance, get into the SUV and start it up, but he wasn't going anywhere. He simply moved the vehicle into the garage before shutting it off, and I heard the vehicle door opening and shutting once more. I took my chance. I bolted from my hiding spot and snuck into the garage, using the SUV to hide behind. The man didn't even notice. He reclosed the garage door, shut off the light, and walked back into the house. I stayed inside the garage for about half an hour, believing he might be going to bed soon since it was late at night. Eventually, I made it to the door leading to the garage and opened it as quietly as I could. I had entered the laundry room, and there was another door. I opened that one and saw a dark hallway. At the end of the hallway was a bedroom with its door partially opened and the light on. I heard what sounded like gargling. He was in fact getting ready for bed. I slowly crept down the dark hallway, careful not to make a sound. I quietly set down the duffel bag I had brought with me and pulled out the taser I had purchased the day before. I heard the creaking noise of the man sitting down on the edge of his bed. That's when I made my move. I burst through the door and shot the man with the taser. I made sure he was electrocuted for a good long time. I wanted him to suffer and also to ensure he wouldn't be able to resist while I bound him to a chair in the corner of the bedroom. He was bigger than me after all. Some time had passed and he had regained his composure. He looked straight up at me and gasped in shock. What the hell are you doing here? How in God's name did you find me? You got sloppy, I said dryly before smiling devilishly. Bet you never thought I'd find you, huh? He just glared at me contemptuously. Start talking. Names and locations, dirtbag. I ain't telling you anything, he said defiantly. Fine, I got plenty of time. In the meantime, we'll just see how much you can take. See how tough you really are. He gulped nervously. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Zachary. Names. Screw you, he shouted. I pulled out my handgun and shot him twice in his left leg. He screamed loudly, and I couldn't help but gain a great deal of satisfaction of watching him in agony. Not so tough when your victims fight back, are you? Now start talking. Go to hell. Perhaps I will, but I'm going to drag you down there with me. I then pulled out the can of pepper spray and blasted him squarely in the face, which led to more screaming. I made sure he got a large dosage. His eyes watered like a faucet and mucus began dripping out of his nose. Talk! You're getting nothing from me. Alright then, I guess I need to up the ante. I then pulled out the hunting knife. Let's see, your fingers? Your toes? Or your gonads? He stared at me silently. I'll settle with gonads. I moved in closer and began to press a knife against the man's crotch. Alright, I'll talk. I pulled back and smiled with satisfaction. That's more like it. He spilled the beans on the names and addresses on every one of his coworkers. He even gave me the address of the abandoned warehouse where they hold their live streams. He said they were planning to have another show tomorrow night. As much as I hated this man, I didn't actually want to kill him. I would have preferred these men be kept alive to suffer in prison forever, but I couldn't take the chance that he might try to warn his buddies that I got on their trail. I pressed the handgun against his temple and was about to pull the trigger. Then I heard a whimper, but it wasn't coming from Zachary. It came from down the hallway. What the hell is that? I said, stepping back from Zachary. It's nothing. There's nothing there. But I was already out of Zachary's bedroom. I heard the whimpering noise coming from another room in the hallway. I opened the door and was heartbroken at what I saw. In the corner of an empty bedroom lay two children, a boy and a girl, tied up and gagged. They couldn't have been any older than 8 or 9 years old. I dialed the police to report a kidnapping, then departed Zachary's house unnoticed. With an arrest and detainment, he wasn't going to be able to warn those bastards. I spent the better part of the next day stalking out the abandoned warehouse Zachary had told me about. Perhaps I could have spent some of the day exploring Reno, but I couldn't keep my mind focused on anything except bringing those bastards down. Eventually, the sun started to go down, and I decided to make my move on the warehouse, whether TJ and his buddies had arrived or not. I took the back entrance in hopes that I would not draw attention to myself. I had my sniper rifle, hunting knife, a flashlight, and taser with me. If what I had seen from their live streams was any indication, it was that they always came armed. I slowly opened the back door, but that didn't stop it from creaking loudly. I tried to maintain my bravado, but that damned creaking noise made me fear I had alerted them to my presence. I decided to press forward despite my fears, my sniper rifle pointing in front of me at all times. The factory was very dim and quiet. Every little noise I heard made me nervous as hell, but I wasn't going to turn back now. I had simply come too far down the tracks to abort. There was a musty smell in the air, but it soon gave way to the smell of death. I recognized it instantly. Spend as much time hog hunting as I have, and you know what the dead bodies smell like. I traced the stench to a door at the end of the hallway. I opened the door and shined my flashlight into the dark room, sweeping the beam across. I saw some freshly dead bodies, some of whom were children. I shone the light to the other side and saw 3 people bound and gagged in the corner, 1 man and 2 women. Using my hunting knife, I cut the ropes binding them. Are you a cop?" the male captive asked. "No, I'm just here to help," I replied. I pointed at the corpses in the room. "What's that?" "Last night's victim. They haven't gotten around to burying them yet. They're running some kind of internet horror show in this place," said one of the female captives. "And we were next in line," said the other female captive. "Not anymore," I replied. "Go, get the police and bring them back here. We're shutting them down for good." "You sure you'll be alright?" asked the male captive. "I'll be fine. These people aren't as tough as they think they are. Now go." All 3 of them scattered out of there as fast as they could. I was left alone to wait for TJ and his cronies. Eventually, I reached the main area of the factory. It was mostly empty except for a few desks, a computer with a webcam, and some extension cords. I noticed a ladder leading up to the catwalk above. I decided that would be a good place to hide while I continued to wait for their arrival. As it turned out, the wait wouldn't be very long. Less than 10 minutes had passed before I saw 4 men entering the building through an entrance in the front. They weren't wearing their masks. The man up front was tall, lean, and had blonde hair. "Where the hell is Zachary? Have you been able to get a hold of him yet?" the blonde-haired man shouted in frustration. I presumed this man to be TJ. "I've been trying to get a hold of him all day, but what? I drove by his house this morning. It was crawling with cops. I guess one of his neighbors knew about those kidnapped children." The blonde man sighed in frustration. "Fine, we'll just have to do it without him then. He was always a little careless. I should have known bringing him on board was a mistake." "Oh, if you only knew, TJ," I quietly whispered to myself. TJ approached the desk with the computer and turned it on. "Bring out those 3 hostages. We'll begin tonight's show within the next half hour." "You got it, boss," one of the other men said as he disappeared down the hallway. I readied my sniper rifle from my perch on the catwalk. The moment of confrontation was arriving. TJ fiddled around on the computer for a minute when we suddenly heard a loud scream. "The hell was that?" TJ said. The henchman reappeared, looking frantic and sweating profusely. "Our hostages! They're gone!" "What do you mean they're gone?" TJ asked incredulously. "They're gone! The door to the storage room is wide open. I walked in and they weren't there. The rope we had used to bind them had been cut." I saw TJ facepalming. "How the hell did... Never mind. We gotta get out of here. If those people somehow escaped, we can expect the cops to be here soon." I wasn't going to give them that chance. I aimed the sniper rifle at the frantic henchman's kneecap and fired. The henchman fell to the ground, shrieking in pain. TJ and the two remaining accomplices began frantically looking around, hoping to find the person who had shot their friend. One of them walked in front of my sightline, and I got a clear shot at his back. I fired and struck him in his spinal cord, ensuring he would be paralyzed for the rest of his life. Now it was down to 2. The last of TJ's cronies rushed to his friend's side, and that's when I took my shot at him, striking him on the right kneecap. But this victory was short-lived as I heard a gunshot ricochet behind me. TJ had spotted me. I got up and ran as fast as I could across the catwalk. I heard one more gunshot, then another. He pumped the shotgun once more, but I heard a clicking noise when he pulled the trigger. Using this opportunity, I shot TJ in both of his legs, and down he went like the rest of them. I climbed down the nearest ladder to get back to floor level. Finally, I had a chance to confront my cousin's killer. He looked shocked to see me. "You!" Surprise. How does it feel to have someone fight back? How did you... Wait. Don't tell me, Zachary. Like you said, he was always a little careless, and it came back to bite you in the butt big time, I said smugly. He chuckled. Okay, now what? You'll be going to prison along with us. Or did you forget the murder you committed on our behalf? You mean under pain of death? You blackmailed me and told me you would spare my cousin. No, I said I might spare her, and in case you forgot, it was my henchman who shot her, not me. Close enough. These men follow your orders like sheep. You could have told them not to do it, and you sat there and watched. The blood is on your hands. I said very angrily. Do you deny any of this? No, I don't deny it. In fact, I admit to all of it. Thanks, you've given me exactly what I needed. I then pulled out my tape recorder and played back the recording. TJ looked shocked at hearing his own confession. It's over, TJ. You have nowhere else to go. TJ gulped nervously. Are you going to kill me? Seconds after he said those words, we began hearing sirens in the distance getting closer and closer. I put 2 and 2 together and realized that those people I had set free had contacted the police and were directing them here. I looked back down at TJ one last time. I saw your little storage room in the back. I couldn't help but notice some of your victims were children. Child killers don't get treated very well in prison. So no, I will not kill you or your cronies. Someone in prison will do it for me. I smiled rather smugly and triumphantly as TJ began pissing himself. TJ and his followers all received life imprisonment without a possibility of parole. I myself ended up on trial for my vigilante actions, but after hearing I had helped rescue 2 kidnapped children and 3 other hostages, the jury was clearly on my side and returned with a not guilty verdict. Also, the tape when I recorded TJ's confession was played at the trial. This meant 2 things. Firstly, that my aunt and uncle received closure on what happened to Lacey. Secondly, it meant the district attorney in Los Angeles would not prosecute me for the murder of Raymond Marshall. Although, I'm glad the story had somewhat of a happy ending. I realized that situations like this are an extreme exception. Take my advice. Stay away from the dark web. It's for your own good.
This story is titled, Let Me In, by Welcome to the Machine 18. In my dreams, I still see her face, those eyes, and the screams. I will forever have questions as to why, what, and who. The most surreal tale of my life, and almost unbelievable. Had I not witnessed this incident with another, no one would believe me. Maybe I should have let her in. My girlfriend and I were driving down a dirt road. We were on our way home from a wedding, and it was around 2 a.m. The dirt road was long and bending, and at the end of the road was the motorway. On either side of the road was a forest, tall dark trees with overhanging branches. We were driving along. talking and laughing about the great day we'd had. With the headlights blazing, we drove slowly. Up ahead, around 100 yards away, there was a sort of shape in the middle of the road. At first they thought it was a rock, or perhaps an animal. But as we got closer and closer, we realized that the shape was swaying back and forth. I realized that the shape wasn't an animal or a rock, but in fact a young woman in a white dress, her head on her knees. We stopped the car, leaving the lights on, but we were both wary due to the odd situation and discussed whether to get out and help. Perhaps it was a guest from the wedding. The wedding was in the middle of nowhere, so surely it had to be, right? Just as I decided I would get out of the car and see if she was all right, the girl stood up and turned around slowly to face the car. Her eyes were wide and she was around 19 years old. Next minute, she let out a blood-curdling scream and started to run full blast at the car. She reached the car and started to bang on the hood. "Let me in." She moved towards the door and tried the handle. The doors were locked, luckily, but she was frantic with rage or fear. Other guests had left the same time as us in separate cars, so there were around 2 other cars driving behind us. They caught up, and when the girl saw the car, she ran at the one behind. However, the man in this car got out, and as soon as the car was open, the girl began snapping her jaws at him, trying to bite his flesh. The man held her off as she screamed, "Let me in! Help me!" She took one bite of the man's finger and ran straight into the woods. 3 years later, I can still see the girl's face in my nightmares. The man who was bitten was tested for all sorts, but incredibly she was clean of any diseases. I wondered what happened to her and why she was like this. I wonder if she's okay. I wonder what would have happened if I'd let her in.
He was the most alluring man Alora had ever seen. There were people all around, taking care of whatever business they had for the day, but their faces seemed to blur out until the only thing she could see was him. He was breathtaking. She couldn't tell if it was the way his hair seemed to wave in the soft breeze, or the subtle stubble that dotted his chiseled jawline. No. It was his eyes, she decided, that truly drew her in and left her feeling naked and vulnerable. He looked and smiled sardonically at her. Alora felt her breath catch. There was something in that smile, something that invited the most delicious of thoughts and emotions. She knew in that instant that she had to have him. He turned with a dancer's grace and slowly left the now useless crowd. The way in which he walked seemed to invite Alora to follow, and almost against her will, she did. She wasn't sure what she was planning to do, though. It was odd enough of her to do something so impulsively, and even odder that she'd follow a perfect stranger she had never even spoken to. But she couldn't help it. Her feet began to move on their own, and with each step she took, images would flash in her mind, daring her to continue. They started out innocently enough. Images of her and the gorgeous man together, laughing and happy. Of her and him at a restaurant enjoying her favorite meal. Of them sharing their first kiss. The last one sent a shiver of excitement through her body. It felt real, not just her imagination. They felt like memories, like promises of things to come. the stranger began to whistle a tune that Alora had never heard before. The sound was intoxicating to her, with each note drifting lazily in the wind. They'd fall down on her like droplets of rain, and with each drop, more and more images poured into her. They became more erotic with each step. Moans of pleasure echoed in her mind along with a curious laugh she couldn't place. It didn't sound like anything a human could produce, but as she tried to focus on it, other images overtook the previous happy ones. Flashes of something altogether non-human stood in a room that was dark and stank of rot. The wind on her face felt sticky, as though she was walking through the most humid of climates, not the typically pleasant Pacific Northwestern evening. She gagged at the smell and held a trembling hand to her mouth. She could see stains of something splattered throughout the floor and walls of the room. In the corner, she could see what looked to be a pile of human bones long forgotten. She cried out in hope as the stranger stepped into focus. But instead of the captivating beauty he possessed, he looked desiccated, as though he himself had died so many years before. He smiled, that same smile that once felt so wickedly enticing as he inched closer and closer to her. The rotting smell emanated from him, clogging Alora's pores. It clung to her skin and made her dizzy. This was something she did not want, and she knew that with everything within her. As he stepped up to her, his disgusting breath just inches from her face, she screamed, and the image disappeared. She was back again on the same path she had been, following the same enigmatic stranger. The wind felt cool on her skin, causing her to shiver. The image was terrifying, but it only lasted the briefest of moments. Yet it was so clear, so perfect in its projection, that it also felt more like a memory than a horrific fantasy. The stranger continued to walk, whistling the same tune as before. She noticed that she neither got closer to him or farther away, despite her having stopped during the memory of that dark room.
Come to me, Alora.
A voice whispered in her mind. It sounded so alone, like someone desperate for their true mate.
Come to me.
It spoke again, and she felt a sudden heat wash over her as her body erupted in a storm of emotion and pleasure. The words held a promise of things to come, of a life filled with happiness and never-ending ecstasy. She sighed at the thought, overcome with the desire to make whoever this man was hers. They continued their walk, always staying a few yards apart. Every time she tried to move faster to catch up to him, the faster he himself seemed to move. Yet he never looked to be in any particular hurry, and his steps never looked like they gained in speed. Alora was puzzled. How was such a thing even possible? But the images and memories would flood her mind again, erasing any doubt she had about following someone she had never met before. Each step caused the intensity of the images to soar even higher, and new images would soon replace old ones. They were far more erotic than anything she could ever imagine, and each breath she took brought her closer and closer to climax. It was intense, something Alora had never felt before. The stranger's face hovered over her own as their moans of pleasure echoed in her mind. The sensations were indescribable as they both reached the conclusion of their love. She looked up at him, eager to see his expression, but instead saw the face of the desiccated man once again. She screamed and tried to scramble away from the image. Bits of rotting flesh cascaded down from his face, bathing her in coagulated blood. She screamed as he continued to thrust, laughing all the while. This was insane. she kept thinking. This isn't real. The man smiled again, teeth missing and falling out of his mouth. She screamed a second time, and the image faded to black. She was back on the path yet again. She panted, still shaken over the violation she just endured. It felt so real. He felt real. What was going on? She asked herself. This is too much. I can't. I need to go home.
Come to me, Allura.
The voice whispered to her again. It was pleading, begging her to not give up hope. Just a few more steps, it seemed to say, then everything will be perfect. Allura shook her head, desperate to make the voice stop. She knew there was something terribly wrong, that whatever was happening to her was not normal. That the stranger, he was not normal. No, she whispered. The wind whipped around her in response. Its caress felt like multiple hands gliding themselves up and down her body. She moaned, in fear, in pleasure, she wasn't sure. Her senses were so thoroughly assaulted that all she could do was ride whatever wave of gratification that overtook her, and wait for it to end. More images flashed in quick succession as the wind's assault continued. They whizzed past, each more indiscernible than the last. They promised her a world filled with titillating desire and ways to achieve the highest of pleasures. It was intoxicating. It was insane. Allura sank to her knees, unsure of what to do next. All lingering thoughts of doubt evaporated, and she was left with only one desire: to find the bewitching stranger and make him hers.
Find me.
The voice whispered to her again and compelled her to move. She could see that he walked into the building to the right, his hand trailing behind him in invitation. She scrambled to her feet, eager to catch up to him. Any hesitation evaporated along with her doubt about what she was doing as she raced to the door and walked inside. She was greeted with a long corridor that led into an inner labyrinth. Unintelligible whispers haunted the path as more images flooded Allura's mind. They were far more intense than anything she previously experienced, making each step more difficult to make. She was determined, however, to find him where she knew he would be waiting for her, ready to turn fantasy into reality.
Find me.
Oh, she cried out as she reached the center of the maze and collapsed, panting. His last words sent her body into an explosion of sensations that left her weak and vulnerable. She cried out again, desperate for whatever she was experiencing to be over. It felt like fire. It felt like death. As Allura tried to regain her composure, she finally took in the room around her. It was dark, dank, and smelled of rot. The floor felt sticky underneath her, and when she looked, she could see that she was lying in a pool of coagulated blood. In the corner, a pile of old bones lay piled on top of each other, with several skulls forming a macabre pyramid at the top. Yet it was the bed in the middle of the room that caught her attention. It was large and sumptuous, the most enticing bed she had ever seen. It promised her a world of ecstasy. It promised her a world of pain. She panted as the realization struck her. She was the prey to whatever the stranger was. Footsteps announced she was no longer alone in the room. She turned her head, frightened now of what she would see. The man, in all his horrific splendor, spoke.
You found me.
It all started as a gag gift, written by Garnet and Opal. My girlfriend, now fiancée Haley, had the tiniest chihuahua I ever saw. It was like a long, scrawny potato that yapped. As a joke, I learned how to crochet and made an ugly Christmas sweater for it. She showed it to her friends, all of them I guess. Online friends, friends at work, friends at church. I think she showed it to strangers, people at the supermarket, people at the gym, anyone who didn't get away fast enough. Then she posted pics online. That is how it all started. A gag gift for my girl's tiny dog. I had to start a business to keep up with the requests. I'm that Mr. Nice Guy who doesn't tell people no. Could I crochet a sweater for your lizard? Sure. Could I crochet a willy warmer for your boyfriend? Sure. Could I crochet nipple warmers for your sister? Sure. At first, I didn't even charge for the stuff I made, but it got to the point where I was spending a lot of time researching and figuring out how to make all these custom things. I thought I needed something for my time. I started my business, worked up how to charge for various items, and worked on basic designs for things that might be repeats. Hooked on Gags was the name I went with. Eventually, the name got me business I hadn't counted on. I think some people misunderstood gags. Pretty soon, I was crocheting up all kinds of fetish-type stuff. Halter tops with collars, wrist restraints, fishnet body stockings, ski masks, lace gloves, stockings. I quit my day job because I just didn't have enough time to fill my orders. Priorities, man. It was either quit my day job, which was now paying less per hour than my crochet gig, or hire employees to crochet what was ordered. Hiring people was a headache I really didn't want. So one day, I get a call from a guy who wanted me to come to his place and design a new wardrobe for his girlfriend. 7 outfits or more. I tried to say no, but he was willing to pay for my travel there. It was an 1.5-hour drive, so I told him it would cost $75 just for me to drive out there and talk through what he wanted, whether he ordered anything or not. Plus, it was in the middle of BFE. Then I let him know if I had to design anything to fit the order, the base charge for the design was $25 an hour. That was okay with him too. We set a date and time, and then I went back to doing what I was doing. Crocheting probably my 20th set of black fishnet stockings. I found it weird during the phone call that he told me his girlfriend's name. Savera. Weird name, too. And he made a big point of it. There was a strange vibe going on, but it would mean a little money in my pocket, at the very least, the cost of an afternoon's worth of time. It also would look good if I put consulting on my business card, along with the crochet. If I ever got around to making my business cards. On a Sunday afternoon, just after lunch with my girl, I packed up the car and left for the client's home. The place wasn't too tough to find, once I made the last turn onto his road. The house was in the middle of nothing, sticking up like a hurt finger. The grass was burnt brown by the lack of rain, and leaves blew across a path tempered down by who knows how many feet, who knows how long ago. There was no driveway, so I just pulled up into the front yard. The black iron fence was right up close around the house, so it looked like a haunted house or something out of a horror flick. In my head, I heard, "Don't go in there." It didn't help that the guy's first name was Mortimer, and my mind went straight to Mortician. He didn't sound spooky on the phone, but Jesus, what a place. Up the creaky front steps I went. The porch was covered in dead vines, dead twigs, and dead leaves. Mort's place was getting my vote for best Halloween decorations. It was November, but he was still winning the contest. I lifted the huge-ass brass door knocker. It was a lion's head. I expected a huge, creepy butler to answer, so I was surprised to see a totally ordinary guy on the other side of the door. Jeans, t-shirt, ordinary height. Maybe he carried 10 extra pounds. It was the kind of weight that's hard to lose. He greeted me, told me to call him Mort, and stuck out his hand. As I looked down to shake his hand, I'm a big guy, I noticed that he was wearing house slippers. It was a weird thing to notice, but it genuinely was the only thing that stood out for me. No male in my family or circle of friends ever wore slippers. I thought of my granddad's term for a hen-picked husband, Pantoffelheld, which means a hero in slippers.
Come here,
Mort said. In contrast to the creepy old haunted house exterior, it looked like a life-size Barbie house inside. Everything was a shade of pink, gold, or off-white. Not a speck of dust was to be seen. It was museum-level clean.
come and meet Cythera.
He led me into the living room, where Cythera was sitting on a dark pink couch. Something seemed off. Yeah, everything was off about Mort and his place, but there was something strange about her. She wasn't moving. I got a couple steps closer and realized she was a doll. I stood there, not knowing what the hell to say.
Sweetheart, this is Elliot.
He looked at me. Finally, I said, "Nice to meet you." Apparently, that was some kind of sign. Mort started talking a mile a minute. Cythera was picky and had definite tastes in all things and favorite colors. I thought pink, gold, and off-white. She needed all new clothes and really wanted a custom look. She needed things for each season and every kind of occasion. Birthdays, holidays, anniversary, dinner, and dancing. The whole time he talked, I was still trying to think of what to say. I was never introduced to a fucking doll before. Finally, he shut up and just looked at me. I tried to keep my face neutral. Okay, I'm going to sketch a couple things, and then you tell me if it's the kind of stuff you're looking for. I pulled out my sketchbook. If you decide on any of it, I'll need to take measurements.
Well, of course.
I've never been a great artist, so I was drawing only the basic strokes. A halter top and shorts, a cardigan sweater, a lacy gown, like those dolly things, yoga pants, a bikini bathing suit, a beanie, and scarf. Mort wanted all of it. I sketched a Christmas sweater and a headband with Easter bunny ears. He laughed and wanted those too. Basically, everything I sketched, he wanted. Then he made an ask, leopard print leggings. At one point, I said, "You've already picked out like $1,000 in clothes."
She is worth every penny, aren't you, Cythera?
It didn't seem to bother him that she didn't answer. He made up her emotions in words.
She's so excited about these clothes. She likes the yoga pants and leggings the best. But she likes the gown too. She likes it all.
He looked at her.
She'll need more. So can you make more sketches?
Sure. Can I have more time? Like a week to put together more stuff? He was so excited about that. I asked if I could email him the sketches, and he was good with that. Now came the tough part, measuring a doll. He was such a strange guy, and he had this fixation with the doll. I didn't want to trigger some crazy-ass fit because I touched it or got close to it. I was sort of toying with the idea of having him measure it for me.
Cythera, sweetheart,
He suddenly said.
Elliot has to measure you.
He looked at me.
She's really ticklish, so you can't touch her ribs or feet.
Without warning, he asked,
Can we talk in the next room for a minute?
He didn't want the doll to overhear something? Christ. Okay, I said, following him to the dining room.
I don't want her to get embarrassed. She's a really private, shy person.
I bit my tongue.
She, wants some of those sexy things you make too. Like the fishnet dress and the bodysuit. Can you sketch up some more stuff like that too?
I agreed, but I couldn't just let it go at that. I was going to open my mouth. I knew I shouldn't, but the whole situation was killing me. I'd been holding in laughter and a few grunts and sighs. He was a client, so I couldn't say what dying to say something. Savera is a kind of unusual name. Where did it come from? He gave me an alarmed look.
Please, don't mention it in front of her.
He said in low tones.
It gets her upset. She was traumatized. She was called a synthetic therapy service doll. I couldn't call her that, so I made a name out of it. Psi instead of inth. Therapy. Please don't say anything in front of her. She has so many bad memories of that place and how they treated her and her sisters.
Okay, this was definitely a walk on the weird side. On the way back to the living room, Mort paused in the doorway and said,
Isn't she adorable? Oh, I have to get my phone.
While I stood there with my mouth open, Mort took pics of Savera. From every fucking angle. All this time I hadn't taken a good look at the doll. I mean, it made me uncomfortable, like I was seeing something about a stranger that I shouldn't see. It was like walking into a guy's house and he has a pair of underpants on his dining room table. You don't want to look. I didn't want to look at his doll. Probably fuck that thing. I thought he would quit after 4 or 5 pics. Apparently, Savera was being just too cute, so he had to get more. I sort of snuck a peek at her face. Huh. She looked Eurasian, with light brown hair and almond green eyes. Her skin was so delicate looking. She had eyelashes. Not big, long, hooker stripper eyelashes. They were like real eyelashes, short and fairly straight. She had light pink lipstick on. Otherwise, she wasn't wearing any makeup. Nope, I looked away. That is probably how Mort got suckered into buying a doll. He looked into its face and got hooked. I mean, that skin. Those lips. What the fuck? I'm sorry to interrupt you, man, I said, but I have to get back for a meeting this evening. After a flurry of apologies from Mort, I walked closer and paused. This was a note for me, too. Mort, I don't want to set her off on a laughing spree. Can you measure her while I write it down? Stupid shit that I was. I thought that was better than maybe touching her and triggering him. Mort took his time measuring her. He had to talk to her.
Oh, sorry, darling. I didn't mean to tickle.
And...
I know, honey. We'll have lots of cuddle and kiss time when we're all done.
He baby talked her, too. I tried to tune it out. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I did pause long enough to get my $75. I felt a little dirty. On the way home, I called Haley, and she laughed her guts out. I was trying to complain, and she was rolling with laughter. I told her to watch her step, or I'd make her crochet all the naughty gear for Savera. She started laughing again. I told her I would make her drive out to Mort's place to fit all that shit on Savera, and she kept laughing.
Oh my god, can I?
That was a double nope. Nope, because I didn't need Haley getting even wackier ideas than she already did. Nope, because that's a client, and I didn't know if she could keep a straight face. Nope, because it was like a Barbie mansion and I didn't need that shit popping up where I lived. Nope, just because... Okay. That was more than a double nope. All in all, I spent 2 months working exclusively on Zathera's wardrobe. Between designing the kinky stuff and making everything to her dimensions, it was solid 2 months of work. I turned away orders from other customers and promised it will all return to normal in a couple weeks. I can ship you out about 2/3 of the stuff you ordered, I emailed Mort. I can email you the invoice, and it will include just those items and the charges for design.
Wonderful.
He replied.
Just let me know the shipping. I'll add it to the invoice.
That was a load off my mind. I shipped off a huge container of clothing and emailed the invoice with shipping to Mort. I had some finishing up type stuff to do on the rest of the clothes. Sewing on little rhinestones and bows, putting in elastic, just little touches. I figured I could get it all done in 3 or 4 days. Getting this wardrobe project done would get this whole creepy thing behind me. Hell, I could take a little vacation. A couple days would do me good. I emailed Mort that I was getting ready to ship the second container. All the same things. Invoice, shipping. It looked like I was about to be a free man. My bank account was fucking flourished. Boom. Up several grand for the first shipment. Boom. Up another couple grand for the second one. All good, right? Well, kind of. The emails started. No complaints. Lots of praise, lots of appreciation in the first email. Zathera just loved every single thing. It was the attachments that made my stomach lurch. Mort sent me a couple pics. Gritting my teeth, I opened the first. Haley was literally walking behind me while I had my laptop open, checking my email. As soon as she heard me say, "shit," under my breath, she stopped to look.
She's pretty. Who's that?
She asked. It's Mort's doll. She leaned over me.
She looks so real.
No. When you're looking at her, she's not so real. I didn't mention how soft and delicate her skin was. The first pic was Zathera in the crop top and leggings. The second was Zathera in the moonlight wearing the lace gown. Haley was breathing on me. A couple days later, I got the second email. More compliments, more appreciation. A link. Why did I click the link? Glutton for punishment. It led me to a folder of pics. All Zathera, all different poses. Sweaters, halter tops, shorts, sheath dress. Every time I looked at her face, particularly her eyes, it creeped me out even more. Then came the email with the bondage pics. Zathera in wrist restraints. Zathera in a half-cup bra and fishnet stockings. Zathera in a dog collar. There were more pics I just skipped right over because it looked like there was a lot of skin showing. I couldn't tell if it was his or its, and I didn't want to see either. Luckily, Haley was shopping with her mom, and I deleted the email. I wasn't so lucky with the next set of photos. Haley was right by my cell when I got an alert for a new email.
I wanna see.
I told her no, then she wanted to know why. She demanded to know why. I had to weigh this out. Which was worse, telling her why I didn't want her to see the email, or showing her. It was impossible to figure out, so when she asked me to hand over my phone, I gave it to her. This is all on you if it's freaky, I warned. It was for Mort. It wasn't a long email, and just a couple attachments. He and Zathera were engaged. The pics and the attachments were not what I feared. The first was an engagement announcement type photo. I smiled, thinking, bet that photographer was surprised, and bet that didn't get published in the local paper. The second was a pic of their hands entwined. damned if it didn't look real.
Is that a diamond ring?
Yep, that was a huge rock on the delicate finger of a doll. Not even 6 months later, I charged Mort $20,000 for a bridal gown and veil. Because he was so antsy about it, I got insured on the package. He sent an extra $5,000 because he said I went beyond what they expected, and Cythera was over the moon. He attached a pic of Cythera looking at the dress.
It's bad luck for me to see her in the gown before we're married.
I felt conflicted about the extra money, but I didn't return it. An invitation for the wedding never came. Haley was disappointed. She was going to buy a dress for it. She wanted to look at the beautiful doll in Mort's place. She called it the dollhouse. Myself, I was okay with not being invited to that shit show. I would have declined if I got the invite. How in the hell would Mort get the dress on her while not looking at her? Would there be an actual preacher? Would they use another fucking doll? Would Mort literally say I do for her? Like, in a girly voice? Nope. It was a triple nope. In time, I just completely forgot about Mort. I refused to use pink yarn for anything, but I didn't really think about why I hated that color. Sometimes I would remember Cythera's skin and feel weird. But for the most part, I didn't think about them at all. Life went on. Sometimes I got weird requests, like crocheting boobs out of velvet yarn, or making a carrying sack for someone's enema supplies. Nothing stranger than people, man. Nothing stranger. So, yesterday I got an email out of the blue. At first I thought it was from Monty, and I couldn't remember anyone with that name. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. It was from Mort. No attachments. He was asking how much I would charge for a baby blanket.
I'm pretty sure our basement is haunted or something. Actually, I know it is haunted. My family and I moved into this house about a month ago. The rent was cheap, and we really weren't in a position to say no or to be too picky. The price of housing has jumped considerably in the local area. It is a 4-bedroom place in the not-so-great part of town. It has a basement, a shitty attic, and the owners lived overseas. They left everything to the rental company. It seemed like they didn't want anything to do with the house itself, but for some reason, they couldn't part with it. At least, that's what it sounded like. We thought it was fantastic. There is nothing worse than a nosy landlord. My parents would take the master bedroom. My grandparents would take the second largest. And my 2 siblings took the other bedrooms. I got the basement, and I was excited for it at first. It was huge, and I would have it all to myself. I was beginning to unpack when I heard a bump. I stopped and looked around. Nothing. I figured it was one of my siblings playing some kind of prank on me. I rolled my eyes, smiled to myself, and began to place my books on the bookshelf. My phone rang. I got up and looked at the number. Private number. So I ignored it, dropped it back on the bed, and turned around. Pick up. Pick up. Pick up. I thought I heard someone talking. Dana? I asked in hopes of hearing my sister's voice. I saw a shadow in the corner of the room. Child size. About her height. There was no one else it could have been. I sighed irritably. Dana, you're getting too old to play those games. I need to get unpacked. Why don't you come and help me? She didn't say anything. My normally incredibly chatty sister was silent. It was extremely strange. Dana, stop being a weirdo and get away from the corner. No one has time for this bullshit. I'm not in the corner. Dana's voice called out from the bottom of the stairs, her green eyes wide in confusion, a glass of orange juice in either of her hands. If she was here, then who was in the corner? I looked back towards the corner and the shadow was gone. Maybe it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I smiled at Dana and gestured with her hand for her to come and sit with me. I happily accepted the juice and sipped the liquid. Still, I could have sworn that I saw something. But maybe it was because the house was new and I was still getting used to it. We sat on the bed and chatted about a few things before the topic came back to the house. What do you think of the house? She fidgeted on the spot. I like it. This room is really creepy though. Are you sure you're gonna sleep in here? In all honesty, after the shadow person in the corner, I didn't want to. Not that I was going to tell her that. Yeah, it's a nice room. Look at how big it is. Was all she said. Normally she hung around a lot, but now it was strange for her. There were so many times when I had to tell her to leave me alone to give me some space. It was as though she didn't want to be here. She went up the stairs and I was left alone in the room. The basement door was closed. And I felt so alone down here. And normally, I like being alone. This was a completely different feeling. The day had turned to night. I had a nagging feeling that I was being watched. I also didn't want to leave my room. I had a weird dream, a nightmare. I can't remember it. Every night I become more and more tired. I didn't want to leave my bed. I stopped spending time with my family and friends. In about a month, I stopped doing everything that I normally love. I stopped socializing and I would get so angry if anyone disturbed me. I didn't want to go out. I needed to get some water and walked up the stairs. My hand tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I struck the door several times to get whoever locked the door to let me out. I kept hitting it. It wouldn't budge. I felt a shiver run up my spine. Someone was standing behind me. I turned to look, and a small child stood behind me. It looked nearly identical to my sister. She was so still, expressionless. The room was so cold. I shook my head and fiddled with the doorknob again. Stay forever, it whispered to me. Stay. You're mine. Stay with me. I kept hitting the door. Where the hell was everybody? The door opened. My mum looked at me confused and asked why I'd been banging on the door. I told her there was a ghost down there, a little girl, and that I didn't want to go down there again. She scoffed and rolled her eyes. My family never really believed in anything paranormal like this, and neither did I until it happened to me. I eventually moved out of the basement. I missed having my own personal space and all that extra room. And now I share a room with my little sister, and while she annoys me, I have more energy again, and I'm happier and socializing once more. I'm happy I don't spend all that time with the creepy little ghost. Every so often, when I'm sent down there to get something from the basement, I swear I can see the shadows move. And I can always hear, stay with me. Fortunately, I think she's trapped in the basement. Why do basements always contain such really weird things?
Housebreaking. A story written by N.M. Wrights. I forget who came up with the idea. We found ourselves short on cash, and an easy score sounded exactly what we needed. Something to pump some money into our meager coffers. Hard times for the dumb and wicked. The house loomed over the intersection at the back end of the neighborhood. A big, old Victorian, the kind packed full of old stuff we could pawn. Eddie got the info from his nosy aunt, who lived down the street. The couple had no kids, no pets, and seemed weirdly codependent to the rest of the neighborhood. They always went everywhere together, always. One car, zero chance of either of them being home if it wasn't in the driveway. Plus, they liked to travel on weekends. Being gone all Friday night meant they would be gone on Saturday night too, sure as rain. I honestly couldn't believe the place hadn't already been robbed. We hung out with Eddie's aunt on Friday night, playing gin rummy and drinking cheap beer while she smoked. Honestly, I enjoyed it. She likes the company, and she's a hoot. Growing old by yourself is a hell of a thing. We all noticed the lack of light from the house down the street, though. The empty driveway beckoning to us. I ran my hands over my thick stomach as I glanced at it, going to seed. As the saying went, tap my fingers across the skin. I needed this score. Maybe it would turn things around. The next night was perfect. The cloud cover had been thick all day, and the guy on the local channel said it would last all night. I had already sweated through the black shirt I wore for nighttime jobs. The humidity here in the summer wrecks me. We ducked into the driveway and circled around the back of the house. Eddie kept a lookout while Chuck and I checked out the door. I almost gasped as he pushed the unlocked door open. watching it swing inward with a slight groan. Somewhere in the primitive reptilian recesses of my brain, something told me this felt wrong. Chuck whispered to Eddie, though, and the next thing I knew, I followed them through the door. I checked for a keypad or motion sensors, but we really had just waltzed into the house. I stood in the kitchen, near the back of the house, trying to get a sense of the layout around Eddie's bulking form. A large man, Eddie's hard-won muscles now laid under a layer of fat he joked could stop a knife from hitting anything too important. We stood in front of a staircase, and Eddie suggested we start from the top and work down. I've wondered since that moment if we still could have run. In that moment, if I could have said that something felt wrong, spent $20 on a few burgers from McDonald's and a case of Ice House, and instead zoned out and watched the late game from the West Coast. Regrets. I've had a few, and as old Blue Eyes once said, they were already dead, of course. Or they weren't. The house, our mark, was no house. It was a maw, a fanged mouth in the night. The house scared me on some visceral level. It looked old, but well kept. Our flashlights danced across the signs of a pleasant home, though at the same time it felt alive with malice. I remember the framed cross-stitch that I passed as I started up the stairs, maybe the last real thing I'll ever see. Sitting there in a nice-looking frame, it said, "Never alone." I know what that means now. We walked up the staircase and came to the second floor. Things looked normal, a hallway with a series of rooms off it. The same worn red carpet stretching across the floor in all directions. I glanced down the hall and saw only a line of closed doors. We walked up another flight and the staircase ended. This floor looked the same as the last. A hallway with rooms off it. We split up to look for loot. I walked into a room and gave it a once-over. My eyes scanned the room back and forth, up and down like a lifeguard, but I looked for things I could pawn. The TV looked too old to sell, but I found a nice-looking jewelry box and snatched it up. I flipped through the drawers, but everything else looked like junk. Out in the hall, Chuck stared out of the window. His wiry body seemed barely visible against the dark glass. "You okay, buddy?" "Lights are out," he replied, his thick accent making it basically one word. "Lights are out." "Huh?" He gestured out the window. "Whole neighborhood. No power." I reached back into the room behind me and flipped the switch on and off. Nothing happened. I shrugged. Good. No power means no one will care if they see a few flashlights out a window. Eddie joined us, and we headed back down a floor. The second floor was obviously used more, and we had more luck. I even found a couple $100 in cash in a nightstand, along with an expensive-looking watch. I bumped a clock radio, reaching for a watch, and it flared to life, sounding an alarm that must have been broadcast over the radio. Emergency alert. This warning is for all residents of Redacted County. Emergency procedures are in effect. Do not go outside while emergency procedures are in effect. Repeat, do not go outside while emergency procedures are in effect. I hit the switch and the radio died. It unsettled me, though. What the hell were emergency procedures? I glanced out the nearest window. Didn't seem to be storming at all outside. I walked back out into the hall, a bit shaken up. just in time to see Chuck disappear back up the stairs to the 3rd floor. Idiot! Eddie came into the hall. Where's Chuck? I just saw him go back upstairs. Upstairs? Why'd he do that? I shrugged. I'll go get him. This place gives me the creeps. Eddie nodded. I walked upstairs and called Chuck's name. I didn't get a response, and I didn't see the glow from another flashlight. Maybe he wanted to pee and couldn't find a bathroom. I checked 3 rooms when I saw flashlights dancing in the hall. Chuck and Eddie stood there. Where were you, Chuck? I asked. Downstairs with you. Why'd you come back up here? I followed you. Why would I come back up here? We stared at each other. Let's get out of here. We've found enough, Eddie suggested quietly. I nodded. We headed down 2 flights of stairs and headed for the exit. We were still on the 2nd floor. We all paused, silently recounting the staircases in our heads. Something didn't add up here. We walked down the stairs again. First 1 floor, then 2, then 5. Each landing brought no escape, but rather another identical-looking floor. We cursed under a collective breath. Every time we hit a floor, somehow hoping that after going up 2 flights of stairs, going down for the 18th time or the 22nd would be the one that freed us. Chuck snapped first. He ran down the hall before running into a room and slamming the door. Eddie and I hit the door seconds after he slammed it shut, literally steps behind his skinny butt. But when we swung the door open, we saw only an empty room. Eddie swore again. This place is not right, man. I kicked the wall in frustration. Let's go down again. If every floor is the same, maybe he's in the same room down a floor? Eddie glanced around the empty room again. Seems as good an idea as any I've got. We walked down the stairs again and re-entered the room. This time, a TV stood on a lone stand and flickered on as soon as we stood in front of it. A news anchor looked sternly at the camera.
Emergency procedures are in effect. Do not attempt to go outside.
His mouth didn't move.
You haven't been right in years, Eddie. Not since that night in Madison.
I looked at Eddie, who just stared at the screen. That's not possible. No one knows about that. When I looked back to the screen, blood ran down the wall behind the anchorman.
We know, Eddie. You should have stayed somewhere safe tonight. You should not have come here.
Eddie knocked me over, running for the door. I dropped my flashlight, and by the time I regained my feet, he had vanished. I didn't know if he had gone up or down the stairs, but honestly, I didn't know that those directions even meant anything anymore. I tried to work my way back up the stairs, finding floor after identical floor on the way. I started checking rooms on each floor, but only nightmares greeted me. One room contained a giant serpent that lifted its great head at me as I opened the door. On the walls of another hung paintings that all depicted my violent death. I don't know how long I climbed. I switched directions multiple times, winding up and down the stairs through the endless house. Now the doors stood open on every floor. I caught glimpses of giant, horrible shapes in the shadows through the gaping apertures. I arrived on a floor, finally lined with hooded figures, each standing in front of a closed door. One door stood opened at the end of the hall, and I could see the dancing blue light from a TV inside it. I entered. On a table in front of me laid a long silver knife. I picked it up and saw Chuck and Eddie tied to chairs in front of me, both gagged and staring at me with fearful eyes. I blinked. They hadn't been there a second before, but they remained. The TV that lit up the room showed the newsroom I saw earlier. But now the news anchor stood in the room next to it, with his mouth sewn shut. You have to choose. I'm not sure where the words came from with his mouth all messed up like that, but I heard them clear as day. I stared at him as he spoke again while crossing the room towards me. Choose. Kill one of your friends. You will be allowed to leave with the other. I glanced back and forth between Chuck and Eddie. Both pleaded at me with their eyes, begging to be spared. I looked at the news anchor. Then, back at them. I had only one real decision to make. Damn if I'm not loyal to the last. The knife caught the anchor in the gut, and he clearly hadn't anticipated it. I heard his voice once more. A mistake. I crashed to the floor, the room suddenly empty, immediately filled with daylight. The anchor, the TV, even Chuck and Eddie had vanished. I laid on the floor, completely alone. I stood up and made my way to the now empty hall. I walked down the stairs and found myself back in the kitchen. And let me tell you, I tore through the door and back to my van as fast as I could. I made record time back to my apartment, and by the time I had realized I hadn't seen a single person the entire return trip, I had already made it upstairs and locked myself in. All of that happened 3 days ago. The view out my window shows me a world devoid of any life. I haven't seen a single car or person in that entire time. Even though I've barely taken my eyes off it, the TV doesn't work at all, nor does the radio. Last night I finally heard a noise in the hall and almost flung the door open in excitement. I barely managed to check the peephole first. I can see Eddie and Chuck standing outside. Their eyes are red, their skin is a deathly gray, and they're standing there, unmoving, watching my door. There isn't another way out. They're blocking the only one, and I don't know how much longer I can wait before I try to get past them. Am I still in the house? Are we all still there? Can anyone see this? Maybe I'll make a run for it.
I bring you this story from the seat of madness. Hence, there may be little credibility to be found here amongst those of sane wit in normal society. Long past are the days when I was viewed competent by my peers. Nevertheless, many stories are never told, but often are buried with the souls who lived them. My silence cannot be kept. I am determined to share the entirety of what took place in the house at the end of the lane. I awoke that Tuesday morning at 4 a.m. to the most putrid of odors. Along with the smell came a cold clamminess and a palpable tension, both of which permeated the manor. I gasped a bit as my naked toes contacted the icy wooden floorboards. My breath frosted the air before me, though it was the middle of July. The darkness felt as though it were closing in around me, the pace of my inhalation quickening as if I'd suddenly become deprived of oxygen. Having acquired my current estate at 1200 Wolf Lane some 20 years previous in the year 1848, never had such a frightening sensation gripped me. I had originally purchased the property as a young man in hopes that it would bring me inspiration for my debut novel. The homestead had a good deal of history, and I'd expected it and the new surrounding countryside would spur motivation in me to create a masterpiece. Sadly, 2 decades into my career, mediocrity seemed to have its claws firmly hooked. I had managed to maintain a meager income at best, just enough to take care of myself and the small family I had the desire of beginning after my recent marriage. Fortunately, my new bride was sound asleep above, safe within the confines of our bedroom. I attempted to run as far away as the soles of my weary feet would carry me, yet I found myself unable to move, at least not in the direction I wished to flee. Instead, I found myself enshrouded by night, being drawn towards the basement stairs. Tonight, the house was as pitch black as an underground cavern. My heartbeat quickened, my body tensing as I continued struggling to escape whatever poltergeist the witching hour had conjured for me. My steps were slow, shuffling, as if I were pulled by some massive unseen force. As I reached the door, it burst open, releasing a blast of air far more frigid than the two upper levels, sending chills anew down my spine as I stood peering into the shadows below. Suddenly, a face appeared in the gloom, the pallid visage of a woman in her mid-20s. She wore a high-collared white dress, blood staining the front of it. Her teeth were bared in a hideous grin as she looked up at me. Her right jawbone was exposed and hung slightly from her face. She spoke, yet her mouth never motioned with the act, the sound coming to me as both one voice and many reverberating whispers as she inquired, "Do you recall me, John?" I was rooted to the top stair in terror as she lifted one daintily shoed foot. Then she was right before me, my head in her hands as she sneered, "How could you have done this to me, my love?" My olfactory senses recoiled instantly upon entry of the horrid stench of that undoubtedly demonic apparition into my nostrils. Vomit bubbled into the back of my throat, and I felt as my knees went weak, giving way from the absolute shock of my predicament. I opened my mouth to call for help, only to find my voice having left me along with any resolve or courage I thought myself to have previously possessed. The cold and the rage were too much to bear, such awful rage. Succumbing to the realm of the unconscious, I awoke sometime in the late afternoon in bed to my wife calling me down to the dining hall for supper. It was as if the events of last evening had been nothing more than the stuff of nightmares after all. Her love of formal dinners had always been my least favorite of her characteristics. I internally despised the strictness of being required to abandon my writing for any length of time while working, but had never wished to disappoint Katya or upset her in any way. So I had early in the relationship resigned myself to the rigidity of this dinner practice so coveted by her, quietly suffering through simply to maintain the smile on her beautiful, slender face. Groaning, I rolled to my feet and tried with increasing effort to ignore the throbbing headache in my temples. The pain's intensity grew, however, as I fumbled through the oak wardrobe across the room searching for a clean shirt to don. Dizziness and nausea overtook me then, and I grabbed for the chamber pot in the corner to my left. "What's happened? Are you all right?" Katya exclaimed, entering the room to find me heaving. Once able to respond, I told her that I would be fine, that a summer illness of some sort had come over me. I told her I would remain in our quarters for supper and perhaps feel better on the morrow. I then turned to embrace her, and both the smile she wore and the color faded from her rosy cheeks, her eyes growing ever wider and concerned. "My God, John, who's done this to you?" she cried and rushed to me, turning me to the vanity mirror. There, on each side of my face, were handprints seared into my skin. I could not believe what my eyes beheld. The comforting theory of it all having been a dream evaporated, and for a moment I felt as though I were plummeting from a great height. I sat down on the edge of the bed, absent-mindedly rubbing my head. Katya began to inquire further, wanting to pry from me anything I would tell her of these strange marks. I refused to give her any new information for fear that she would delve further into the matter, though why I so feared that aspect I had no idea at the time. Days passed, then weeks, months, and years. 10 years to be exact. I'd sealed the doors to the basement. Things in the house as well between Katia and I had long since returned to normal, though there was still the rare occasion in which I would awake in the pre-dawn hours fighting the strongest of urges to return to the cellar. I'd not seen the woman in the white dress again, but could not avoid the notion that it was she who called to me from down below. One grand thing had come from the experience. Fear had become my muse for my writing. I never told anyone my own story, but used the inspiration I gained from the unexplainable phenomenon to create a very successful novel series. At long last, I'd risen to fame as an author. I was finally able to give my wife all the luxury and finery either of us could have ever dreamed of, the estate being filled now with the most fashionable furniture, exquisite wall decor, richly embroidered tapestries, etc. Then I learned that Katia was with child. My child. My life could not have been more magnificent. Little did I know, it was not meant to last. A week after learning of my fatherhood, I began waking in the night, drenched in cold sweat, the same deathly sulfuric waft as that dreadful night once again thick in the air. At first it was only the smell, and only at night. Then it filled the house during the day as well. I alone seemed victim to it, and was most thankful Katia had been disturbed by none of this. The angst to go downstairs grew stronger than ever along with the fetor, and I began catching glimpses of that horrible woman. This was only in passing initially. I would see her in the corner of my eye, yet when I turned to look, she had vaporized into nothing. Things escalated quickly, however, and she soon began following Katia around the house. She always stared over her shoulders, grinning malvoyantly at me or giggling manically and running her fingers through Katia's lovely dark curls. Beginning to fear for her safety in earnest, I told her of the sightings, naturally leaving out details on what had happened all those years ago. She laughed me off, telling me I'd spent too much time writing as of late and I should take a few days to get out of the house and enjoy the springtime whilst it remained. A part of me, a large part, wishing and hoping she was right, took her advice. It was late April, the sun comforting in its warmth, the breeze calm as if just for our pleasure. We gathered everything we needed, stowing it in our picnic basket and strolling through the nearby meadow to the tree line where we sat in the shade of an ancient elm to take our sustenance. The longer I spent away from the house, the happier I became, and truly did feel as though Katia had been most accurate. There was still a gnawing sensation in my gut, though, that longing to return to the basement, or to at least look toward the house. Finally, I could harbor it no more. I pulled my flask of scotch from my breast pocket for some liquid courage and glanced up the narrow drive toward the isolated estate. I involuntarily breathed a sigh of relief upon seeing that all appeared to be fine, at least from where we were. When we returned a few hours later, we were bewildered to find the house in utter chaos, and all the servants terrified beyond their wits. It looked as though a tornado had ravaged the mansion's interior. Every single room was in disarray. Most terrifying to me, though, was that the basement door had been torn open, laying splintered in the foyer. I tried as hard as I could to persuade Katia to traverse the 20 miles to Chicago to take refuge in a hotel while I took care of settling things back down. She refused, being that the baby was due at any moment. She didn't want to risk giving birth on the road, along with her desire to help any way she could. I did win the argument over her resting for the evening, however, and was quite proud of myself. How my regret abounds over that decision to this day. I would do whatever it took, even if it meant taking my own life, to avoid what was to come later that night. I awoke the same as so many nights previous. The cold, the reek, that feeling of a powerful magnet in my chest pulling me. Unlike the other nights, though, Katia was not lying in her sweet repose undisturbed, but was gone from the room. Knowing somehow that she was below, I flew down the basement steps, tripping along the way and crashing to a heap at the bottom landing. My forehead smacked against the hardwood, and it was as if I were transported to another time. Images flashed rapidly before my mind's eye, memories, it would seem, of myself and that vile creature which had been plaguing me. Only in these memories, she was quite possibly the most gorgeous woman I have ever seen. Far more so even than Katia. She suddenly seemed so familiar to me, and yet still too strange to place a name to that elegant physique. The picture before me changed from one setting to another. A masquerade, a family gathering, private moments between she and I that I racked my brain to recognize. All scenes were from this house, transitioning so quickly that I could no longer maintain concentration, until it suddenly halted on one. My cousin Malcolm and the woman stood facing each other in the parlor. The expression on her face was one of both exasperation and intimidation as he closed the space between them, wrapping his arm tightly around her waist to pull her against his chest. She threw her hands up to push him back, to no avail. He crushed his lips roughly to hers regardless of her fight to free herself from his grasp. Then it all came crashing back to me. I had immediately assumed her disloyalty upon catching the two of them alone. At the time, I cared not how desperately she tried to inform me of the truth. In my fury, I'd beaten her, then walled her into the basement pantry. I had left her there, badly wounded, abandoned her to die. How I had managed to repress such a disgusting crime committed by mine own hands was well beyond my understanding. The blood drains from my face at the realization even now, and I shudder to think of the grotesqueness of it all. Anna. The name left me as a whisper, full of disbelief, though at long last I knew exactly who the phantom was, and how I had wronged her. I found Katia in the corner of the cellar in front of the brick wall. She had clawed the thing until blood dripped from her fingertips, and still more pooled around her. My only thoughts were of her safety and of the babies as I cautiously approached. She turned on me like a rabid dog as I reached for her, producing a carving knife I'd been unaware of. "She's here, she's here! You forgot about Anna, she's always been here!" She kept frantically repeating, backing away from each step I took forward. Her eyes darted wildly about the room, tears streamed down her face. I stretched out my hands to reason with her, anything to get her back up those steps to make sure our baby was all right. Then suddenly Anna manifested behind her, glaring at me over Katia's shoulder. "Hello, John. My vengeance is finally here." Once again, her lips never moved, but the words echoed in my head. I wanted to plead, beg for forgiveness, for her to end this insanity. Before I could speak, though, Katia let out a shrill scream and plunged the knife through her thin gown and into her pregnant belly. I fought to stop her and found myself totally paralyzed. I stood there, forced to gaze in horror as she stabbed again and again, before slumping lifeless to the dirt floor. Dear God. A single whimper at last vibrated through my vocal cords. Having crouched to my knees, I crawled through the dust to Katya and my baby. I cradled her in my arms as the warmth faded from her body, sobs shaking my own to its core. Everything to follow was completely a blur. But I do recall the authorities upon finding me after the servants had discovered everything in a state of sheer upheaval. The knife which had been in Katya's hand was found gripped tightly in my own. I'll never have proof, but I know it was Anna who put it there. Needless to say, I have been blamed for the homicides of all three deceased, as they also recovered Anna's body. Nary a soul has ever deigned to claim belief in my rueful tale, and I have been confined to live out the rest of my life in this asylum. Sorrow, such unimaginable sorrow, will follow me until the day I perish. On the anniversary of her death, Anna always manifests to me, reminding me that she will never be forgotten, and that I shall never have peace again.
Are you going to lay in bed all day? It's time to get up.
Jennifer pulled off the covers, trying to get her boyfriend out of bed. After being together for 1.5 years, David and Jennifer had finally made the decision to get an apartment, and this moment would never come again. He wanted to make the first morning together last for as long as he possibly could. Dave held on to Jennifer's hand and pleaded playfully.
No, don't go. I'll be lonely.
Jennifer giggled as she pulled her hand free.
Fine. You can stay in bed if you want, but I'm hungry.
Her thick butterscotch hair billowed majestically like sails in the wind as she glided across the room with the same grace and delicacy in everything she does, but then stopped for a moment to look back at him. A smile like ribbon candy stretched across her raspberry lips, and her willow eyes sparkled like precious gemstones as they met each other's gazes before her departure. The memories of the previous evening gave David such pleasure upon reflection. The first night they had a meager dinner of instant ramen and sat on the floor, as they hadn't brought in their table yet. After dinner, the two of them shared a bottle of wine. Jennifer drank most of it. Then they danced by the lights of the city, glittering through the window to music only they could hear. He wasn't usually the romantic type, but Jennifer practically dripped with allure, and he just couldn't help himself around her. He buried his face in her hair. She smelled like sugar and warm vanilla. Even the memory, as mundane as signing the paperwork to make the apartment officially theirs, elated him. He was crazy about her. As he lay in bed, lost in thought, he heard her calling his name. She didn't sound pleased. His long hair draped down his back like a cape as he followed her voice into the kitchen, tucking his red streak behind his ear. The refrigerator door was wide open, and all of the food was on the floor. Granted, there wasn't much, as the couple had just moved in, but it was still strange.
What did you do, Jen?
He asked. Jennifer cocked her head in confusion at him.
Nothing. It was like this when you came in here. You mean you didn't do this?
Dave shook his head and replied,
Why would I have done this?
Why would I have?
Then they heard loud banging coming from a floor above them.
Sounds like they're doing renovations upstairs. Maybe that's how everything got thrown around. Good thing we don't have kids, huh? This kind of thing might have happened all the time.
Dave cringed at the thought. He was indeed grateful they didn't have kids. It's not that he didn't like them. He just didn't want any of his own. Kids. That was the word that triggered the memory from the night before. The less pleasant memory. Jennifer had no trouble getting to sleep. Her cheeks were flushed with sangria. But Dave was restless and went to the living room to watch videos on his phone so he didn't disturb her. It was midnight by the time he was ready to turn in for the evening, when there was a knock on the door. Dave looked through the peephole, but didn't see anyone. The light over his door looked like it was out, and the hallway was quite dark. He looked down as he peered through the peephole and saw a shadow. He opened the door and found the silhouette of a little boy standing before him. He couldn't make out any facial features on the kid, but he couldn't have been any older than 7.
"Can I come in?"
the boy asked. Dave was a bit unsettled and stood there staring at him for a minute. Part of him wanted to let him in out of instinct, but something about the boy made his skin crawl. Something he couldn't explain. His logic kicked in, and he asked,
"Are you alright? Do you need help?"
But he said nothing. They stood there staring at each other for some time. Not a word was spoken from either of them.
"Can I come in?"
the boy repeated, piercing the silence once more.
"No,"
Dave responded at last, remembering his voice.
"You don't know us. What would your parents think if they found you in a stranger's apartment? Especially at this hour. Go home."
And he gently shut the door in the boy's face.
"That was weird,"
he thought to himself. As he turned the lock, he thought he heard a sound coming from the little boy on the other side, and he pressed his ear to the door to hear what it was.
"Ringa, ringa roses, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. Ringa, ringa roses."
The boy's melody continued as it slowly disappeared down the hallway. Dave's tongue became cotton in his mouth as he backed away from the door and silently turned into bed, being careful not to wake Jennifer. He never did tell her about the little boy. It was almost lunchtime by the time the couple had finished cleaning the kitchen. Most of the food was just cold cuts and various containers of preserved fruits and vegetables, and they were still cold and in their respective containers, save for a few broken jars. Jennifer's stomach growled. She still hadn't eaten.
"You get yourself something to eat. I'll go to the store and replace what we lost,"
Dave said as he threw the last of the broken jars in the trash. He grabbed his keys and planted a kiss. The familiar taste of honey on her plump lips was more addictive than nicotine, and it put him back in good humor as he pulled on his shoes and headed out the door. When Dave came back from the store, he went to the kitchen to put away the food he bought, and he found the bread open and the cold cuts on the counter. He picked up the meat to put it away, but it had gotten warm. It was no good anymore. He was a little annoyed, but he composed himself before going to find Jen. He wasn't going to get anywhere if he acted out of emotion. He found her sitting by the window with a cup of tea, staring out at the steel jungle.
"I know you probably just forgot, but next time you make a sandwich, could you put everything away, please? The bread was open, and the meat's been sitting out."
Jennifer lowered the tea from her lips and looked at him with puzzlement.
"Sandwich? I had a bowl of cereal."
Dave let out an exasperated sigh and shook his head as he walked back to the kitchen. Bowl of cereal indeed. Something occurred to him, though. He wasn't gone for very long, 10 minutes at the most, and he had placed the meat back in the fridge himself before he left. It shouldn't have been so warm. He brushed it aside and went to close the bread, but when he picked up the bag, he wrinkled his nose in disgust when he noticed that the bread was covered in a vile green mold. As he pulled back the slices to inspect the damage, he realized that there wasn't a single slice that could be salvaged. There's no telling how long that loaf had been sitting on the store shelf before they bought it the day before. But even so, it had been just fine when they bought it. It shouldn't have molded so quickly. He spotted something out of the corner of his eye on top of the refrigerator. He reached to grab it and saw it was a bowl with a spoon in it. A few cornflakes were stuck to the edge of the bowl, and a bit of milk was still on the bottom. Okay, so she did have cereal. But why was her bowl on top of the fridge? He could only assume she had put it up there herself, but he couldn't fathom why. Save for the kitchen fiasco that morning, the rest of the day had been relatively uneventful. They had brought in a few more of their belongings from storage, including their sofa, their table set, and some of Dave's electronic equipment so he could do some recording. Ignoring the incident with the bowl, he had thrown away the bread and the deli meat without saying another word about it to Jen. He didn't think it was necessary. He would simply go back to the store tomorrow and get more. There was no sense in starting an argument over something so trivial. He did call the apartment manager, though, to tell him about the lights in the hallway, despite being apprehensive about calling him. The manager was a salty alcoholic and had previously owned a seedy motel before landing a job at the apartments. Paradise, I think it was called. Dave hadn't wanted the apartment specifically because of the manager, but Jennifer fell in love with it and with the community, so naturally he went along with it, telling himself that they just wouldn't deal with the manager unless they absolutely had to. But this situation was an absolute necessity, especially with children roaming around at night. The manager had told Dave that he had inspected the lights that morning per the request of another tenant, and that they were fine, and to stop wasting his goddamn time. As the sun began to set and the hallways darkened, the automatic lighting system came on. The fluorescents blared over David's door, confirming the abrasive manager's claims. That evening, he had trouble sleeping again, and had stayed up to do some research for a video. His heart jumped in his chest at the familiar knock. He paused before going to the door and looking through the peephole. Once again, the hallway was dark, and once again he didn't see anyone, until he looked down. He knew what was going to happen next, and yet he couldn't stop himself. He opened the door and saw the silhouette of the little boy again. Or maybe it was a different one. He did seem a little taller than the night before, but that could have been forced perspective from the distortion of the shadows.
Can I come in?
He asked.
You again?
Dave replied, half anxious, half irritated.
Is this gonna happen every night? Go home, kid!
And he closed the door in his face.
Who is it?
Dave turned around to see Jen standing there, rubbing the sleep from her eyes.
Just some kid wanting to come in.
Jennifer blinked.
Do they need help?
She asked as she went to open the door. But when she did, the hallway was empty. Dave told her that this was the second night in a row the boy had come to their door.
We should call CPS. Maybe he's in trouble.
He felt so ridiculous for being so disturbed by a little boy, and had hoped to avoid calling anyone about this, as he was afraid he wouldn't be taken seriously. But she was right. He went to pick up his phone to call, but then saw the clock. The time read 12:01. He told her that he would have to call them in the morning. Jennifer shook her head and turned off to bed. It could have just been an auditory hallucination. But as Dave turned to follow Jen to the bedroom, he thought he heard the boy singing a quiet, familiar melody that gave him a feeling like someone had walked over his grave. The next morning he called Child Protective Services to let them know of the little boy, neglecting the more unsettling details. The agent on the phone asked the standard questions, like where the incident happened, and asked for a description of the child. He told her the name of the apartment complex, but that he couldn't see what the kid looked like. There was a short silence on the other line before the agent told him that they had been getting multiple calls about a little boy at that same complex. They had gone to check on several occasions to the point of launching a full investigation, but they never found anything. She promised Dave they would check again, but expressed doubt that they would be any more fruitful than they had been before. He hung up his cell phone and stared at it for a long time, deciding to wait to tell Jen what he found out until she woke up. But he was unsure of what to make of the whole situation. It had all been so strange. His mind was swimming through murky waters, trying to piece together the events of the past few days, trying to find some kind of connection. The bread, the fridge, the bowl, the boy, nothing made sense. He felt like he was going insane. He knew there was nothing more he could do, but he still felt so helpless, so useless. He found himself pacing around the living room, trying to gather his thoughts and clear the fog in his mind. Then his eyes caught something in the corner. Bits of black broken plastic were gathered into a pile. He got closer to it and saw a circular piece with the word Nikon printed on the rim. It was from the lens of his camera that was completely destroyed. A loud banging sounded above his head again. If the parts of his camera were strewn across the apartment, he might have been tempted to believe that it was more collateral damage from the renovations upstairs. But they were in a neat little pile, which meant the sabotage was intentional. He knew he hadn't done it, and there was only one more person in the apartment. Dave felt his cheeks go hot. That camera was expensive. He had no idea why Jen would have smashed his camera, but nothing was going to get solved if he exploded. He gathered the sad remains in his shaking hands and placed them gently on the kitchen table. He wanted her to see exactly what he wanted to talk to her about before he even said anything, but he wouldn't wake her. He would wait until she got up on her own. It would allot him enough time to cool down before talking to her. He took a few deep breaths and went to the bathroom to splash cold water on his face. But when he bent down over the sink, what fell in front of his face pulled his stomach into his throat. He looked up at his reflection in the mirror and confirmed what he saw. A section of his red hair was cut to the middle of his neck. He ran his fingers through the section in hopes that he was dreaming. But he got to the end of it, and he felt his fingers fall through the straight edge of the cut. His teeth clenched, and his knuckles went white. He was seething. He pulled his hair back with one of Jennifer's hair ties and stormed out of the apartment. He had never raised his voice to her before, or had even wanted to. but there was no way he was going to be able to hold himself back from screaming at her if he didn't get out right now. He wandered the city for hours, trying to distract his mind from what had happened. He almost succeeded once, but then some of the cut section fell out of his ponytail and he remembered why he was so angry. Even his attempts to dissociate to try to figure everything out were proving to be unproductive. It was well after dark before he finally went back home. He was so furious when he left the apartment that he had left his phone behind, and he didn't wear a watch, so he had no idea what time he had gotten in. But when he stepped out of the elevator to his floor, he noticed that it wasn't just the light in front of his door that was out. The entire hallway was saturated with darkness, dimly lit only by the sheen of the moon glimmering through the main hallway window. He passed by one door and was stopped by a scent so rancid that his eyes watered. He glanced over to see his neighbor's door wide open, with a mysterious dark substance smeared all over the door jamb. He walked over and ran his finger through the liquid and inspected it by moonlight. It was blood, and it was still warm. His heart desperately pulsated in his chest as he looked down the line of doors to see them all covered in the same dark substance. Then his face turned to ice.
Oh my god! Jen!
David flew down the hallway so fast that the hair tie snapped, causing his hair to fly in the wind whizzing past him. He lived only a few doors down, but the hallway seemed to stretch the farther he ran, like he was running in slow motion. He threw open his door and frantically called her name.
Jen! Jen! Jennifer!
He opened the door to the bedroom, and the same putrid stench hit his sinuses like the fumes from a fire. Then he dropped to his knees when he found her. Or what was left of her. Torn pieces of her flesh decorated the room like a mosaic in a morbid tribute to her former beauty. Her blonde hair was thrown in clumps around the room, still attached to her scalp. Her intestines were strung from her stomach to her neck as she dangled naked from the ceiling fan. There was no telling how long she had been hanging there. A wave of anguish, of panic, and of guilt boiled through him like a noxious stew, and he retched. He had to call the police. He had to find his phone. Where did he have it last? Shit!
The living room!
He rushed to the living room, remembering the call he had made that morning. He tore the living room apart looking for it, but it was nowhere to be found. Then he heard a door slam. It was the bedroom door. He had seen only Jennifer's corpse when he went in there, and had only assumed that she was alone. Her killer was still in the apartment, and they knew Dave was there. His whole body quaked and adrenaline rushed in his ears. All rational thought was gone at that point, and he made a mad dash for the bathroom, killing the light and locking the door. He didn't know who was morally capable of doing this, and he didn't want to find out. And without his phone, all he could do was hide. He saw a shadow slowly pass under the door, and he clapped his hand over his mouth. He didn't dare move. He didn't dare breathe. He didn't dare make a single sound. But his heart pounding in his ears fooled him for a moment into thinking that whoever was out there could hear it. Then he saw the shadow again. This time, it stopped in front of the door. A large pair of scissors slid under the door to his feet. The silver blades gleamed with the sparse light peering through. Dave could see the fresh blood on the handle, but that wasn't what disturbed him the most. caught in the screw of the scissors, was a long, red hair. He ran his fingers across his neck, realizing they must have cut his hair while he slept, and how close they had come to his throat. He felt himself begin to panic. They know he's here. They know, and they're toying with him. What the hell do they want? What are they?
Can I come in?
A tiny voice sounded on the other side of the door. It was the little boy. He slowly lowered his hand from his mouth.
Maybe he's in trouble,
he thought to himself as he reached for the doorknob. There was no logical reason to think that this little boy would have had anything to do with Jen's murder. But nothing about these past few days had been logical, and his mind screamed at his stupidity. His hand wrapped around the knob and turned. But when he pulled the door open, what stood before him paralyzed him. It was indeed the little boy. But now the features of his face could be seen clearly. A blank expression peered behind his dark hair, cut in a simple bowl shape. His plain gray clothes were soaked in blood that didn't appear to come from any wound on his little body, and his eyes were solid black. In his tiny hand was held Dave's cell phone, and he could see there was only 1% left on the battery. A voice on the other end said,
911, what's your emergency? Hello? Hello?
Then the phone went dead. But not before he had seen the time. 12:02. David blinked, and suddenly two more like the little boy were standing in front of him. Same blank expression. Same gray, blood-soaked clothes. Same black eyes. The three of them stared at Dave and said in perfect unison,
Can we come in?
Freddy wasn't your typical 13-year-old. He was an asshole. If he wasn't in his bedroom screaming at video games, he was scaring his 7-year-old sister. Every traumatizing prank he pulled on little Amy would be worse than the last. Once he had her even told that their mother had been murdered and covered the kitchen floor with ketchup for maximum effect. He was the reason she was so unstable. She would often tell their mother that she heard whispers and had even seen ghosts wander the house at night. Freddy would giggle at that, almost proud of the damage he had done. But unfortunately for Amy, it was never enough for him. He felt compelled to break her. Completely. The storm had kept Freddy awake that night. Restlessly, he tossed and turned in boredom. For a while, he tried to count sheep, but even that didn't help. In defeat, he lay mindlessly watching the raindrops slide down his window. Lightning flashed suddenly, illuminating his entire room. It was soon followed by a deafening boom. Freddy smiled. He knew what was then to come. Freddy heard his sister crying through the wall, closely followed by a faint pitter-patter as she ran to their mother's bedroom. This was it, his moment of fun. He crept down the hallway and into Amy's bedroom. He prowled around the room like a serial killer, studying every inch of it. Countless ideas rushed through his mind. Then he saw the closet. Freddy waited in the dark for what seemed like forever, peering through a small gap between the closet doors. He had decided that when his sister returned and settled into bed, he would begin to whisper. Then, once she was completely terrified, he would burst out and run at her, screaming at the top of his lungs. He had almost lost all hope and was about to leave when he heard the footsteps approaching. His mother opened the bedroom door, and Amy slowly shuffled in. She was sucking her thumb and dragging her favorite blanket behind her. As she crawled into bed, Freddy couldn't help but grin in excitement. Freddy watched in silence as their mother tucked Amy in tightly into bed, planted a big kiss on her forehead, and finally said goodnight. He waited anxiously until he heard his mother's door close before beginning. This is it, he thought, shaking in delirium. The moment I break her. Amy, Freddy whispered hauntingly. She didn't respond. Amy, he continued, still no response. I'm in the closet, Amy. Come play with me, he harshly croaked. Not tonight, Lucy, Amy calmly replied. Freddy frowned in confusion. She must be sleep-talking. Wake up, Amy, it's not. A hand reached out from behind him. It pulled Freddy back into the darkness and clutched over his mouth with a cold, tight grip. She said, not tonight.
So, a little backstory. I'm a part-time custodian for the town that I live in, and only work when I'm needed. I have pretty much worked at every school in the district, including the middle school that I attend. It's a fairly old school, built in the early 60s, and is actually being torn down in about a year to make room for the new middle school that will be replacing it. I love that school and never want to see it go, but it's kind of a dump. But every time I get the opportunity to go back and work there again, I always accept. I have always been a firm believer in ghosts and have had a handful of experiences, but had never experienced anything at that building before. Until last winter. I was working a 3-night stint at the old middle school on the second floor from about 2 p.m. to 9 p.m. Quite frankly, I didn't need 7 hours to go about the nightly routine of cleaning, but I was fine with that. On the first night, I went about my business, knowing I could pace myself, but was still flying through my work. I'm not overly social, and when I work night shifts, I actually like them better, because most people are gone by 5 p.m., and I can just have my headphones in and listen to music, podcasts, etc. It was about 5 p.m. when I was sweeping classroom floors in the science wing. All the doors were shut and locked, which is mandatory in the science wing, with the lights shut off in the rooms, meaning that all the teachers had gone home for the night. Now, this detail is important. I have had this system when it comes to cleaning rooms, and it's very simple. When I've done everything that needs to be done in the room, I shut the lights off of the room, but when I know that I have to go back in the room for whatever reason, it will be a stain on the floor that needs to be mopped or a rug that needs to be vacuumed, I leave the lights on in the room as a reminder to go back in at some point. There was one room in the wing that needed a wet mop pretty badly, so I left the lights on and the door open, and figured when I was cleaning the bathroom floors in that wing later on, I would make a stop in that room and give it a quick mop. At this point, it was probably around 7 p.m., and I had just finished taking a break with my coworker, Jeff, who works on the first floor. I go upstairs to my closet and gather my bathroom cleaning supplies. About 30 minutes later, I make my way back to the science wing to clean the bathrooms and classroom floor. When I get down to the classroom, I notice that not only is the door shut with the lights off, but the door is locked. Now, I know this wasn't me. I never close the classroom doors until I go around to shut the hallway lights off at the end of the night, just in case I need to go back into the room. I am so positive that no teachers were left in the building. I unlock the door and the lights are flipped in and off position, so I flip them back on. I then immediately ran downstairs to ask Jeff if he had been in the science wing at all in the last hour or so, and he said no. I then asked if there had been any teacher meetings in the main office or teacher's lounge. The answer was also no. I told him what had happened, and he wasn't surprised at all, saying that he thinks the building is haunted. We talked for another minute or two, and I went back upstairs to the classroom, and what do you know? The lights are off again. I always try to debunk every experience that I've had, but I cannot for the life of me think of anything that would have caused these things to happen. It was the middle of December, and the building was always cold, though there were no windows open, and I made sure of that. I have no explanation for the lights flipping off twice, and no explanation for the door locking on its own. I walk about the entire upstairs, looking in every classroom, trying to find any sign that some teachers could have still been in the building, but I found nothing. I went back to mop the classroom floor and finished the rest of my work for the night. Night 2 was uneventful, but night 3 was the most eventful, in my opinion. The whole night I had a feeling of someone watching me, and not your normal feeling of being watched, but also as if I was being followed, especially once all the faculty and students were gone. One could chalk this up to paranoia, but this feeling only got worse once I thought I heard footsteps around me a few times. Not heavy footsteps, they were more like light shuffling. I ended up back at the science wing bathrooms. Now these bathrooms are faculty only, and the doors are always shut. They both open by just simply pushing the door. No knobs or levers to turn, but the woman's room on the left isn't normally shut all the way. It stays popped open on its own by about half an inch unless you pull it closed all the way. I always start with the men's room on the right. I go in and out of the boys' room a few times to grab things off my cart. At one point, I open the boys' room door and take 2 to 3 steps in when suddenly the door to the girls' room slams shut. It wasn't just the normal slam. This was loud to the point where I jumped, and I don't scare easily. I go back into the hall and the door is shut. I open the door to the girls' room, certain that no one is actually in there, but just to be safe, I do my normal. Hello? Is anyone in there? Custodial needs to come in. With the door just cracked open, no response. I open the door fully and both stalls are open and there is no one inside. I lean back into the hallway and shout for Jeff, thinking he somehow pulled a prank on me, slamming the door and then running into a nearby classroom. But then it occurred to me, these bathrooms are pretty far removed from any classrooms in both directions. If it was Jeff or a kid playing a prank, I would have seen them. A few seconds after shouting to whoever may have been listening, I swear I heard faint whispers. The problem was I couldn't tell what direction they came from. It was like they were all around me. I asked them to speak up and suddenly went silent. I must have spent 10 minutes playing with the door trying to figure what could have caused the slam so hard. There are no windows that could have blown it shut, and the only vent in the room is on the other side of the room, and it does not blow hard enough to move the door with that kind of force. If at all, I quickly finished my work in the bathrooms and swept the hallway floors so I could finish up for the night. Once I had finished, I took one final walk around to shut off any classroom lights and lock any doors that may have been left on or open, as well as shut off any hallway lights. While doing this, I made sure that I did not have headphones in. If something wanted to get my attention, I was going to make sure they got it. Nothing happened while I made my final roundup, so I went downstairs to find Jeff. I had asked him about the bathroom door slamming and where he was around the time. He told me he was in the 6th grade classrooms by the kitchen, which is on the first floor and on the opposite side of the building. He also said that he had never experienced that bathroom door do anything weird before. But then again, he had never worked the upstairs wings before. I walked with Jeff, talking to him about random stuff as we went about shutting off his lights. It's probably around 9:15 p.m. at this point. Yes, we were a little late at this point, but I don't really mind. As we made our way down near the music wing, something urged me to look back down the hall from which we had came. So I did just that. I turned to look and I still get chills and smile like a madman when I think about what I saw. I saw a dark gray transparent figure, shaped like a person walking from left to right down the hall towards the gym. I immediately started running down the hall to try to see it again, but played it off to Jeff like I thought I had saw a real person was going to direct them out of the building. But I know what I saw. There was no people in the building. There was no basketball players, no extracurricularities going that late. There shouldn't have been absolutely no one else in the building at all. I turn the corners and I don't see anyone. I check all the bathrooms and there is no one. I check further down the hall around the corner and there was no one. I look outside to the front plaza and there wasn't a soul. No people, no cars, nothing. At this point, I honestly got teary-eyed, but not because I was upset or scared, but because I was happy. To that point in my life, those were the most intense experiences I had ever had. I firmly believed that someone was trying to contact me over those 3 days. Jeff and I had finished up and went home. I have since been back to the school a handful of times, but unfortunately have not had any truly great experiences like I did those 3 nights. Other than the shadows that were sometimes seen in the corners of my eyes, but who really knows for sure if those are spirits. They were nothing like a walking figure that I saw, so I chalked them up to my mind playing tricks on me. But like I said, who can be sure? The woman who normally works the upstairs wings of the school doesn't believe my stories. She has worked there for 11 years and says she has never experienced anything in that building before. But she is also one of the most closed-minded people I've ever met. She doesn't believe in ghosts and won't even ponder the idea of aliens for life outside of the planet. She says I only saw what I wanted to see and experienced what I wanted to experience. But quite frankly, I think that is bullshit. My theory is that since I was clearly interested in what the spirits were doing, given that I would spend significant amounts of time trying to debunk my experiences, they tried to keep my attention almost like they were starving for attention altogether. I also think it's possible that since I was in a middle school, the spirits may be that of the middle school age kids, and they were doing juvenile things just to mess with me, like shutting me out of the rooms and scaring me by slamming the door. And then when I called for the voices I was hearing, they'd go silent, like students sometimes do when they get yelled at for talking during a test. It's all theory, but I think those ideas make sense, and I hope that they make sense to whoever may be reading this. I know these aren't the scariest encounters, but they are very near and dear to me. Like I said, I've always believed in ghosts and have had some smaller encounters with what I believe were ghosts before, but up to that point in my life, these were the most intense encounters I'd ever had. I've had some more encounters recently, some at another school that I believe is haunted, and may post them here at some point soon, but for now, I will leave it here.
Hey, I'm Toby Pasta. I am a horror YouTuber who looks at many different things within the horror genre. I started out my channel by looking at those internet screamer pranks, like the car going down the hill video and the scary maze game, just to name a few. And I have a few cool videos unboxing horror stuff. I also plan on making videos where I look at horror movies to see how good or bad they are. So, if you're interested in that, then feel free to visit my channel and give my content a watch. Feel free to let me know if you'd like to hear any bad creepypastas as well, because I wrote a few bad ones in my lifetime. You know, that's actually a pretty good video idea. Anyways, come check me out at youtube.com/TobyPasta.